Warning: some contents may be disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I have always been a bit of a night owl, and I've always had this weird mindset that makes it easier for me to sleep late in the morning and into the day, and then be active at night. As such, I often found solace and comfort in long open night drives. To me, the empty roads, the silence of the night, and the cool breeze of the summer as it blows through the window, well, there's nothing like it. However, I do have one event that happened on a particular night drive that left me feeling terrified. Of course, it hasn't stopped me from going for my drives, but it definitely left me in a weird position. It was a cloudy night, so it was rather dark on the side roads where there were no streetlights, and the only thing keeping me on the road were my headlights. When I go on these drives, I like to go out into the areas where there just aren't a lot of houses or people, which, where I live, isn't hard. On this drive, I was heading into parts of the county where there were mostly trees on all sides of the road, and the roads narrowed out pretty thin. I was driving through the trees, and the branches started to canopy over the road, which made it even darker. But I was pretty familiar with all the roads though, so really, it wasn't that big of a deal, no matter how dark it got. As I drove further, however, I started getting this really weird sense of impending doom, like something was really heavy in the air. This is something that I have never felt out in these roads. Yes, it can feel a bit claustrophobic if you get too far into the unincorporated areas, but for the most part, there's never really a sense of fear or dread that hangs over these parts. At that point in time, there absolutely was. I started to slow down a bit to try and see if I could figure out what it was that was causing me to feel like this. And after a while, I saw something that was a bit strange. I saw a man walking on the side of the road. And now, that wouldn't be odd in most places, but where I was, there were no houses, no people, and definitely no reason for a person to be walking out on the side of the road this late into the night. What was even weirder was that this man wasn't dressed for a long hike or anything. He was dressed in all black, in a button-down shirt with a black tie, and also a hat. I think it was a bowler hat. At first, I was thinking that it was weird, sure. But then, my next thought was, wait, what if this guy broke down on these back roads and he has no idea where he is or where to go? Note that I am not an incredibly social person, to be honest, but I was sitting there and thinking about how I would feel if I was in his position and the only car for miles just drove by without even checking on me. So with that thought in mind, I decided that I would stop and at least see if he was okay. I pulled over to where he was walking, and as I slowed down, the previously mentioned feeling of something was wrong definitely got worse. Like, it went from a looming feeling of something is wrong to that thing that is a threat is present. I almost just said screw it and then drove off, thinking that this guy was going to pull out a gun and then shoot me and then try to steal my car. I know, it's hard to explain, but part of me still thought that I needed to stop for him. And as I did, the man stopped walking and slowly turned to look at my car. I rolled down my passenger side window and just kind of shyly asked if he was okay. Part of me expected him to be this creepy looking guy with a deformed or maybe demonic face or something. Just something to justify why I was feeling so freaked out as I approached him. but he looked absolutely normal. In fact, he actually looked friendly, and part of me just thought that I was losing it. When I asked him if he was okay, he slowly walked over to the passenger window, leaned down to look at me, and said that he was fine. There were a few moments of silence between us, with him just staring and me trying to put together another sentence. But I eventually did. I asked him if he was in need of a ride or anything like that, or if he needed to make a phone call. At this point, he leaned closer. He put his hands on my door and just stared at me. Again, he didn't appear threatening, but something was setting me off inside. After staring for several more moments, his straight face shifted to a smile and he just said, "I think you should just keep going." He just stood there staring at me with that same smile, and I just sort of choked out an okay, and he nodded. He then pulled back and gave me a wave, and I just shifted the car back into drive and I pulled away slowly. And I glanced back in the rear view a few times as I did. Each time, I saw him just standing there, watching me drive away and smiling at me, until he was no longer near enough for me to see him. The mood was definitely dead after that, so I just took some side roads until I got home and I decided to go to bed. I know that this was such a non-event, but to me, for some weird reason, it was so beyond terrifying. The way that he just seemed to release this threatening aura and be normal, and then the way that he just told me to keep driving, like if I stuck around, something bad was going to happen. It felt like both advice and a threat, like if I stuck around, it was going to be a problem for me. I think what made it so creepy was that it was the middle of the night, like 1 or 2 in the morning, and he was just there. Again, there were no streetlights, no houses nearby, no business or anything. He was walking in the pitch black down a dirt road in the middle of a rural part of the country. Maybe he was harmless and just wanted to disappear. Or maybe he was something more. I have no idea, and I don't want to know, to be honest, because it just scared me. I'm glad nothing more happened, and I hope to never see that man again. Back when I was fresh out of high school, I used to be a pizza delivery driver for a certain pizza place that is open really late, like way later than it needs to be. I admit that delivering pizzas at like 1 in the morning is a genius way to get business from drunks and stoners. But I also have to say that the pay sucked, and I was never more tired than the 9 months that I worked at that place. This experience was a few years back, but thinking about it and how it could have gone seriously makes me feel like I want to get sick. I won't. I'll push through getting the story written out though, but it really does cause a bit of panic in me. It was a pretty typical Friday night. I was nearing the end of my shift and was actually on my last delivery from the triple that was thrown on me by my jerk of a manager who knew that I was about to leave. This being my last delivery, it was the furthest out of the 3, and it was definitely in a more spread out and remote part of our town. I don't live in a big city, but it's fairly concentrated with houses that circle the epicenter, and then our neighborhoods that spread out in every direction. This delivery was in one of those out on the edge neighborhoods. I pulled up to the house after circling the neighborhood a couple of times trying to find the numbers, which, in tangent, if you order pizza delivery, please turn on your light so we can see your house numbers. Anyways, I circled a couple of times, I found the house, and I grabbed the pizza to walk it up to the front. The house looked decent. It wasn't run down or anything. It was just really dark, like the occupant was in bed or not home, which, yes, did make me feel a bit uneasy about this delivery. Though, it wouldn't have been the first time that I had taken a delivery to a drunk person that had passed out after putting the delivery in. I knocked a few times, but there was no answer. I pulled out my cell phone and I called the number on the order, but it was disconnected. At this point, I assumed that the delivery was either a prank or the aforementioned drunk person. I sent my boss a text saying, "Knocked, no answer, phone disconnected, heading back." And I walked back to my car. I tossed the pizza bag into the back seat on the passenger side, and then I started to walk to the other side of my car to get in. When I started hearing footsteps coming up from the side, my dumb self thought that maybe it was the customer coming out to say, "Hey, sorry, I fell asleep. Can I get my pizza?" But of course, it wasn't. No. Instead, it was a man wearing a pink hoodie, dark jogging pants, and walking straight toward me with a gun pointed right at me. I put my hands up and I immediately braced for him to rob me. But after a moment, he finally spoke up and said, "Keys, now!" I nodded. I reached into my pocket and I handed the guy my keys. And after a few moments of my heart racing and my face being drenched in sweat, he motions towards the car and says, "Get in the passenger seat." At first, I was thinking I was about to die. And then, I was thinking that I could try to run as I got around the car, but again, where was I going to? I was in the middle of a mostly empty cul-de-sac, nowhere to go but open fields, and he could easily put a round in my back if I ran. At this point, I realized that I had no choice but to follow what he wanted me to do. I quickly complied with his demands, and I got in the passenger seat of the car, thinking that this was seriously going to be my final few minutes. He got in the driver's seat, started the car, and started driving down the side roads. I just sat there, helplessly, silently staring at the streetlights as we passed them, thinking about what I could say to plead for my life. My hands were seriously shaking and my mind was racing as it occurred to me that this man wasn't wearing a mask, which meant that he didn't care if I saw his face. And to me, this meant that he didn't plan to leave anyone to identify him, so I was definitely going to die. As we drove in silence, the carjacker seemed to become more and more agitated, glancing around nervously, muttering things to himself, staring at the clock on the road randomly back and forth. It honestly felt like several hours were passing, though it was probably only a few minutes. I started thinking about whether anyone would notice that I wasn't back after a while. I assumed my manager would notice after a while since I had cash that belonged to the store, but that was about it. A lot of strange things go through your mind when you're in this kind of situation, because the only thing that I could think about was how I was going to get fired if I was killed. Again, not logical, but it was all that I could think of. After another few moments, the carjacker pulled over to the side of the road and started breathing fast. I didn't look at him. I didn't turn my head, and I just shut my eyes thinking that this is where he cracks. And after a few moments, he screams, This wasn't what I fucking planned," and punches the steering wheel. I jumped, and I couldn't help but look in his direction, and he was seriously crying, like sobbing. His eyes were filled with a strange mix of anger, desperation, and regret. And then he turned to me and said, I'm sorry that we had to meet under these circumstances. His voice cracked as he said, and he just shook his head like he was seriously upset. A couple more seconds passed of this awkward silence, and then he turned, reached behind me, grabbed the pizza bag, and exited the car, walking off into the woods on the side of the road. For a moment, I was too stunned to move, but as the feeling in my arms and feet slowly started to come back, I realized that the danger had passed. I jumped over to the driver's seat and then sped away, eager to get the hell away from that man and also this place. The entire time that I was driving, my lip was quivering, my teeth were chattering, and I was shaking, thinking that it wasn't actually over, that something else was going to jump out at me and then attack me. Obviously, nothing did, and I was able to make it back to the store. I got into the safety of the building and I broke down. I was bawling my eyes out, trying to explain that I was carjacked by this man, trying to explain everything that I had just gone through. Thankfully, my coworkers were able to get me settled down. But then after a few moments, my manager asked me why I hadn't called him or the police. Honestly, at no point did it occur to me while I was driving away from that situation to grab my phone and call anyone. Stupid, I know, but panic makes it hard to think clearly. They did call the police and they took my statement, but I couldn't tell them the exact location that he had gotten out of my car, only where he had actually carjacked me. I doubt he was ever caught, because all that I could tell them was what he was wearing and a vague direction of where he could have gone. I'm thankful that he didn't decide that I was a threat to him or that he needed to do worse than he did. And I honestly think about that night a lot. The fact that I got out unharmed, that he apologized and then stole the pizza. What kind of situation does one have to be in to do that? I don't work there anymore as mentioned, and I don't do anything related to driving my car or the public. I work in a warehouse now and I absolutely love it because there's literally no opportunity for anything like this to happen ever again. About a decade ago, I had an honestly chilling experience while I was out driving at night. I used to work a really weird shift and I got off the clock at 2 a.m., so my drive home was incredibly boring and empty. For the most part, the highways were completely dead and I was typically able to get from point A to point B pretty easily. As mentioned, I was driving home late that night, just taking my usual route and enjoying the summer breeze as it blew through the windows. It was a really nice night. There was no one else on the highway, and I was just cruising at a bit above the speed limit with some chill tunes playing way too loud through the car speakers. About halfway through the drive, I was rounding one of the curves and started on a downhill portion of the highway, and my eyes sort of landed randomly on what looked like a person just down the road. I slowed down, thinking that there was no way that this person was walking on the shoulder of a highway with a speed limit of 65. But sure enough, it was. Thankfully, with it being as late as it was, and the highway being completely open like this, I was able to slow down to see if the person was okay or if they needed any help. But as I slowed down, I noticed that the person kind of looked disoriented and they stumbled a little bit, like he was either drunk or he didn't know where the hell he was. I hit a point of being concerned for this person's well-being, and I immediately hit my flashers and stopped next to him. I approached the man cautiously, and as I got closer, I could see that he was a much older gentleman. He looked disheveled with unkempt hair, wearing what looked like a dark red bathrobe and also house slippers. What bothered me was the fact that his stare was empty, like his eyes were completely vacant. I rolled down the window and I asked him if he needed help. He paused for a moment, looked at me, and then started saying a few things that honestly did not make any sense to me. I remember two specific things that he said. He kept looking for his house because it kept disappearing, and that he couldn't ignore the voices in the shadows. I was starting to really get worried at this point. I knew that I couldn't just leave him there or just ignore this, as it was pretty clear that something was wrong with this man. After a bit of a back and forth, I was able to convince him that I could help him find what he was looking for, and he actually did get into my back seat. I figured, if nothing else, him being in my car was safer than him walking on the shoulder of the road, and I could probably just get him to a nearby police station so that he could get help. But as we drove, his ramblings kept going. It was making me feel a bit anxious. I didn't think he would do anything, but part of me was kind of getting this weird feeling like he could do something, and he wouldn't be fully aware of what he was doing. After a bit of driving, I was able to get to a police station, and I told him to stay in the car while I went in to explain to them what was going on. Thankfully, they didn't ask too many questions about why I had let him into my car or who I was to him. I think my panicked demeanor helped them to realize that I wasn't doing anything malicious. The officer came out and tried to speak to the man, but he just kept saying the same things about the house disappearing and the shadows talking. The officer glanced at me and I just shrugged like, "I don't know, man. I'm just trying to help." The officer helps the man out of the car and asks me if I can stick around the station to fill out some paperwork and maybe answer some questions if they have them. I agreed, and I sat there on the bench for something close to an hour. I was starting to doze off when the original officer finally came back out and asked me to go over my story again. I told him that I was heading home from my shift. I then saw the man on the shoulder of the highway and explained that I stopped because he seemed like something was wrong. And I explained that he was saying a lot of things that didn't make any sense to me. The officer nodded and wrote down what I had said, and then mentioned that he had found some information in the wallet that the man was carrying. So, to explain what exactly had happened, this man was in danger. Apparently, he had actually lived at a retirement home almost 3 miles down the highway. The officer confirmed that he had gotten a hold of the retirement home and then spoke to the employees there, and they confirmed that this man lived there. At some point, after everyone had gone to bed, this man had managed to get out of his room through one of the exits, and he walked the full 3 miles down the road. Unfortunately, he did have dementia, so why he got out, where he was going, and what he was thinking in walking down the highway like that is anyone's guess. He was adamant about the disappearing house and those voices in the shadows, so maybe that had something to do with it? I don't know, honestly. The officer told me that they had someone from the facility coming to get him, and then mentioned that the facility was likely going to be doing an investigation into how he got out, so at least that made me feel a bit better about him being safer from then on. They then let me go, and the whole time that I was driving home, I was seriously staring at the shoulder of the highway and making sure that there wasn't anyone else there. I knew there wouldn't be, but I was feeling seriously anxious about it for some reason. About a week or so later, I actually got a card in the mail from the retirement home, and I'm guessing that they got my information from the officer when they picked up the man. It was a card with a photo of the man and a few of the nurses. He was smiling and wearing a little birthday hat, and it mentioned that he was celebrating his 89th birthday. There was a short note on it thanking me too, so that was nice. And I was glad that he was back with the people that could help him. This was a long time ago, so it's likely that he is no longer with us. But I do hope that he was able to live out the rest of his time comfortably. And I hope that they were able to keep him secured in their facility after that night. I have family members that live in the middle of nowhere, way outside of any major town or anything. And of course, they are the family that I tend to go and see during the holidays. Thanksgiving is one of the major holidays for my family, as it was my grandmother's favorite day, and we get all the extended family on her side together to have a lovely meal, and it's always a good time. This story isn't about the get-together though. It's about something that happened after the fact. Most years, I would stay at my aunt's house and leave early the next morning. But on the year that this happened, I was working for a company that was doing a merger with another organization, so they had pretty much limited time off to only the specific holiday, and because of this, I had to get home that night so that I could get up at 6 a.m. and then get to the office early the next day. If nothing else, it was a pain in my ass as I hate driving late at night, especially for the full hour that I have to drive to the north to get home, and the fact that they live in the middle of nowhere, which means that there are absolutely no streetlights. I tried to leave at a good time, but it was hard to leave my family that night as they wanted to continue talking and spending time together. So by the time that I got out of there, it was around 10:30 at night. I get out of the driveway and out onto the dark roads, making the necessary curves, trying to keep my eyes open and my mind focused on the trip. I was definitely struggling, like really struggling, to keep myself awake. I think that digesting all that food and the hard spike in my blood sugar had really started taking its toll on me. I could feel my eyelids starting to drop as I was going. The longer I went, the harder it was to keep myself going. So I figured that the best course of action for me was to put on some music. Unfortunately, I have an older car that doesn't have any sorts of wireless connectivity. So when I listen to music, it has to be on CD. The disc that I had in was not going to be enough to keep me awake. I needed something heavy and aggressive. So I ejected the CD and I slowed down a bit so I could reach down onto my floor to grab my CD folder. I will say that this was incredibly stupid. I was taking my eyes off the road and focusing on reaching down to grab my CD holder. And like I said, stupid, but it's what I did. I reached down, grabbed my folder, and grabbed a disc from some metal band, and when I looked back up on the road, I noticed a figure standing there in the middle of the road. I panicked, and I slammed my brakes to do my best to avoid hitting whatever or whoever this was. Thankfully, despite the car being old, it did have a good braking system, and I was able to stop pretty quickly without flipping my car or driving into the streets on the shoulder. When I came to the screeching halt, I was gripping the wheel and I was just trying to breathe through my excruciatingly painful heartbeat that was pulsing in my head. I honestly thought that I was about to have a heart attack, considering how high my blood pressure was over those couple of seconds. After a few moments of taking deep breaths and just staring at my dashboard, I finally was able to get my mind back to reality, and then realized that I needed to make sure that I actually didn't hit whatever that was. I looked up and out all of the windows and in the mirrors, trying to see if I could see anything. But there was nothing there. I was confused, panicked and trying to not literally pass out. Where the hell had this thing gone? What the hell was that thing even? I pulled the car over to the side of the road and I parked it so that I could get out and look around to see what was going on. I stepped out onto the road and walked a bit back, looking into the shadows of the road that was lit only by my taillights. I stared at the darkness, squinted to see if there was anything there, when I did see something. In the darkness, I could see what looked to be the same figure, still mostly shapeless, but almost human-shaped, just standing in the darkness and looking in my direction. I lifted my hand and I waved and I shouted back to see if this was a person and if they were okay. I shouted, "Oh, hey, is everything all right?" And as I did, this figure just stood there motionless. I was starting to get freaked out, thinking that this wasn't a person, that it was something else, something supernatural. I started to walk backwards toward my car, keeping my eyes on this figure, and as I got to my car and reached toward my handle, I heard what sounded like laughing, like a high-pitched voice that was giggling in the distance, in the direction of whatever this thing was. Well, that was all I needed to hear. I threw my door open, got in, and I took back off down the road to continue my trip. I drove the rest of the way in silence, my heart keeping up its stupid fast rate, staring in my rearview mirror every 10 seconds to see if this thing was following me somehow. Obviously it wasn't. Whatever the hell that demonic thing was, it stayed there in the dark, a fact for which I was very thankful. I got home and I struggled to go to sleep that night, just kind of staring at the ceiling with my heart just pounding like hell. Honestly, I don't think my BPM dropped below 120 until the next morning. Like, my body was reacting intensely to the whole thing, like my instincts knew that whatever this was truly dangerous, and it would have been much worse if I hadn't taken off. To this day, I still can't explain what happened on that drive home. I've tried to rationalize it as my imagination just running wild or some sort of prank. But deep down, I know that something truly terrifying was watching me. I've since avoided that stretch of road. I found another way to get home from my aunt's house, and the memory of that night still haunts me. For anyone that has any sort of name for this thing or an explanation, please do let me know. I can't physically describe it other than it seemed to be just a living shadow on the road that stared intently. It looked like a person, sort of, but it was mostly shapeless beyond that. It was just intensely dark and creepy. I know that this doesn't help much, but it's the best that I've got for it. Anyways, that's my story, and I hope that I never experience anything like this for the rest of my days. I don't know if this will gain any traction, but this has been on my mind ever since it happened. I'm a respiratory therapist that works at a local hospital. I was on my way to work, about less than a mile drive from my occupation, when the car in front of me quickly merged into one of the emergency lanes as if something sudden had just happened. And then he just sat there, no hazards going off, nothing to indicate that he planned on moving. I still had 20 minutes before I had to be at work. Assuming this individual may be in distress or have car problems, I decided to be a good Samaritan. I parked on the shoulder of the road and I turned on my hazards. We exchanged eye contact and I gestured a wave, rolled down my window, and I asked, "Are you okay?" He seemed to have either not heard me or ignored me, but he did seem to realize that I wanted to help him. He gets out of his car at this point. Keep in mind that we are on an extremely busy road. I'm in my work scrubs, which tends to help people relax, knowing that they are with a healthcare professional. However, this was different. When he got out of his vehicle, I assumed that he would have told me that he was in some type of pain or something that caused him to pull over abruptly. He had been driving fine the entire time that I was behind him. So, I casually get out of my vehicle and I walk over to the back end of his car. This is when I officially start a conversation asking if he's hurt or if something is wrong. You know, all the basics. But the thing is, his eyes were cold. He had this body language to him that almost made him seem a little unhinged or skittish. He had not answered any of my questions, so I tried once more asking, "Hey man, we are in the middle of a busy road. Is there something wrong with your car or something going on with you?" He simply replied, "No." I started to feel this sensation of discomfort, like he wanted to do something to me, but he was restraining himself. So I continued to play it off. He didn't seem drunk or high, but he had these black beady eyes that I couldn't stop looking at. It was as if he was just a vessel to something dark. I tried to continue the conversation. "Why did you stop, man? You don't want to get hit out here." And he replies, "I don't know. I don't know where to go." I didn't know what he meant by this, so I questioned further by saying, "Do you know what city you're in right now? If you're lost, I can tell you where the nearest highway is." His reply was a little chilling. "Anywhere but here." I was now so confused. He didn't know where he was but felt this urge to get out of the area as quick as possible. So I asked, "Well, what direction are you wanting to go? 75N will take you to Dayton. You take 75S and you'll head to Cincinnati." He then asked, "What would you do in my position?" Now, I have no idea what he meant by this, but I simply said, "I don't know what kind of position you're in, man. Can you drive? The hospital I work for is within view and we don't have to go in. I just want to make sure you don't get hit." He agrees to follow me, but once I turned on my blinker to turn into the hospital, he completely stopped following me. He pulled a U-turn and then sped off. I know this isn't the creepiest thing in the world, but you really have to try to understand just how foreign and strange this behavior was. Each time we engaged in conversation, it was as if he was contemplating to tell me something, but ultimately remained silent. From the looks of it, he drove a red Toyota, a RAV4 hybrid maybe. So, I mean, he didn't have a broken down car or look like he was a substance abuser. He just seemed incredibly nervous, and his fast motion gestures and twitches of all his body language has left me puzzled and still gives me shudders when I think about how he moved, talked, the lack of response, declining any help, and not explaining a single reason as to why he just decided to park on the side of the road. A simple, "Oh, I'm just lost," would have been enough for me to feel better about the entire situation. He just seemed incredibly paranoid and hesitant. On top of it, the entire conversation led nowhere to his situation or why he was acting so strange. I just wanted to make sure that he didn't need help or get hit by a car. Anyway, I'll update you guys if I hear anything about a patient coming in later. He also has a face that is burned into my memory. I just got this gut feeling to leave, but as polite as possible. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? I want to start this story off by saying that It isn't necessarily a horror story, although it was absolutely scary for me, as some people may come out of this story thinking that I'm preachy, and I don't really care if that's how you feel by the end. This story is one that is a necessary cautionary tale for anyone that may put themselves into these kinds of situations. This happened when I was 21, and honestly, it wasn't that long ago. It was in the early 2010s. Back then, I was the type of kid that thought I was invincible. I ran on Red Bull more than sleep, and I know that there are a lot of people out there that do the same. I hope that this story does not get through to some of you, and again, preachy. I know, but it's an important experience that needs to be put out there. I was driving home from college on a Friday night, trying to get out to my parents' place to spend a few days so that I could get away from campus. I had made this drive numerous times, always late in the evening, and I had never had any issues with it. It was a long, monotonous drive, one that was partially main roads and partially winding side roads. On this night, I'd been on the road for a couple of hours, and it was pitch black out, and I thought that I was doing okay. I had just chugged the second Red Bull for the drive, and the caffeine was causing my heart to beat fast and my mind to race. I was getting kinda jittery, my left leg bouncing on the floor and my right foot holding the gas pedal down. My eyes kept wandering onto the dull glow of the headlights as they passed, and despite the fact that I was starting to feel a bit lightheaded, I was determined to make this drive without stopping. As the next hour wore on, I started feeling my eyelids grow a bit heavier, which was actually making me angry as I was running hard on the caffeine of the energy drinks. Yet, I was starting to feel tired. My brain was focusing way too hard on how I was feeling, how tired I was starting to get. I started thinking that I should pull over and take a minute to take a breath, that my getting lightheaded was something serious. But being the stubborn guy that I was telling myself that I only had about half an hour left to go. It was probably the rush of adrenaline that was kicking my ass at the same time that my brain was begging me to sleep. But I was arguing with myself inside about stopping. And in the end, my stubborn side won. And I slapped my face telling myself that I wasn't going to give up that easily. And that's where things went completely wrong, and my life would change permanently. It must have only been for a couple of seconds, but in the brief moment that my eyes fell shut, my car veered slightly to the side. The sudden jolt of the tires hitting the gravel on the shoulder snapped me awake, only to see that I was heading off the road. Panicking, I overcorrected and quickly went from correcting and trying to maintain to completely losing control of the situation. My car skidded across the road and I slammed into a guardrail, causing my car to flip multiple times before finally coming to a hard stop just before hitting a large tree. Now, the force of the impact is beyond description. The glass all shattered, and the only sound alongside the metal crunching was me screaming my lungs out as the whole thing happened. Time seemed to completely slow down as I felt myself being violently tossed around the interior of my car. And when it finally came to a rest, I was nothing shy of disoriented and in shock. I could feel my breathing slow down, the world was spinning, and I could feel blood drip down my face as the pain of the situation slowly settled in. Despite my injuries, I was able to crawl through the destroyed door and pull myself close to the shoulder of the road. I don't know how I got as far as I did, but I had managed to get close enough to be seen. I lay there, trembling, crying, screaming as loud as I could while in excruciating pain. After what was probably a couple minutes, A car drove by and they saw me. I will say that after I heard, "Oh my God, call 911!" I completely blacked out. There's a huge chunk of time that is completely gone. My memory goes from hearing that to seeing doctors trying to keep me alive and then waking up when everything was done. The aftermath of all of this was a nightmare. I spent a couple of months under medical care, undergoing surgery and physical therapy. My body was broken in ways that I couldn't imagine, and the worst of it was my left leg, which was so damaged that they had to amputate it up above the knee. From what I was told, it was completely destroyed, and the fact that I didn't bleed out while crawling was nothing shy of a miracle. At the age of 21, I was permanently scarred and handicapped to the point that now I spend a lot of my time in a wheelchair. I've had to adapt to having a prosthetic, and everything has been different. I have so many scars from that night, and I often find myself jumping in the middle of the night, screaming as the memories of the crash keep playing in my head. I have adapted, thankfully, but it hurts so much to know that had I made a better decision that night, had I just pulled over and maybe taken a quick nap, I would have been okay. I would have been none the worse for wear and made it to my parents' house, and life could have been normal. But I didn't. I didn't make good decisions, and I have to live with the consequences. Again, this isn't for pity, but a warning for anyone that thinks that it's smart to push themselves to the end of their rope, that thinks it's okay to keep going when they are tired. The consequences of falling asleep at the wheel can be devastating and life-altering, of which I am a prime example of. It's not worth it, so take care of yourself and listen to your body, and don't end up with a story like mine. I have a weird experience that I wanted to share that was just, well, I honestly don't know what words to use to describe it. It was creepy in its own right, and honestly, it left me feeling a bit shaken. Thankfully, I came out of the whole thing unscathed, but I kind of feel like it could have gone much, much worse. So, to start off, I'm a delivery driver for a restaurant that isn't the normal kind that does delivery. I'm the only driver for this specific restaurant, and while we aren't as busy as, say, pizza shops, we do get enough orders to keep me busy for the entire shift. Because of this, I put a good number of miles on my car, and I drain my tank pretty frequently. Sometimes, I have to stop at random stations along the way or in between deliveries to make sure that I have enough miles left to get to the next stop or stops, and then back home to base. It takes a good amount of coordination, and I have honestly pushed it once or twice to a limit that I don't like to push it to. This was, unfortunately, one of those times. It was near closing time, and I was on the last 3 deliveries. It was a triple, so I had to take one, then the next, and then the next as quickly as I could. I had gotten the first one done. I looked up the location for the next, and as soon as I did, I noticed that the mile counter on my car showed 3. Basically, I had 3 miles to go until it was on a hard E. I wouldn't say that this was the most accurate reading, but again, I don't want to end up randomly stranded with 2 people's dinner sitting in my passenger seat. So, I hit the button for the nearest gas station, and sure enough, there was one that was between 1 mile and 2 miles from where I was sitting. It looked like it was kind of tucked in between a couple of neighborhoods, like this was a really weird place station, but I was just thankful that it was close. I then pulled away and made the quick trip to the station. And sure enough, it was there. Google was not lying to me at all. The building was dark, like they had closed up for the night, but the pumps had card readers and were definitely still on based on the lights that were shining on the screens and overhead. I pulled into the parking lot and then got up to one of the pumps. I got out, swiped my card, basically did all the things that one does when they are filling their tank. After a couple seconds, I noticed a couple guys standing next to the building. One of them was sitting on the ground and smoking, and I could see the embers glowing in the dark, and the other was staring at me from under his hood. Of course, I was a bit on edge. I had cash on me from the deliveries, but at the same time, with where he was standing, I would have had time to throw the pump and jump into my car before he could even get close. So, assuming that he didn't have a gun or anything, I was cautious, but pretty sure that I was safe. I go back to filling up, and as the amount hits 5 gallons, the pump just suddenly stops. I stare at it, squeeze it once or twice, but sure enough, it was done with me. I looked up at the machine, then toward the building, as if there was going to be someone there to help me. When I noticed that the man with the cigarette in his mouth was now standing at the emergency shutoff valve, which explained why the pump stopped working. Within the second that it took me to realize that it was just him, I heard footsteps behind me and I thought, I really just let this happen after telling myself that I was going to be fine and that I would have time to jump in my car. I'm seriously about to get robbed by this creep. I turned slightly, and as expected, the man with the hoodie on is approaching me. But strangely enough, he's not getting too close, like he was walking toward me, but stopped about 6 or so feet from me. He lifts his head a bit to stare at me, and I look at him. And there were several very awkward moments that we shared standing at this gas station pump. The whole time I was just thinking, I'm dead. I'm absolutely dead. This is how I'm gonna die. While glancing between him and the man at the shut-off button on the building, making sure that neither of them is getting closer or pulling a gun or something. I have no idea why I did this, but I looked at the man in the hoodie and just kind of shyly said, the pump isn't working. Like this man worked here, I was going to go troubleshoot the problem. I really don't know why I said this. I guess it was just me being scared and confused as to what was about to happen. The man smirks, looks down at me, then up to the machine and says, "Station's closed." As if I wasn't already being awkward and weird, I pointed toward the card reader and said something like, "Oh, but I should be able to still get gas. The readers are 24/7. This guy in the hoodie seriously started laughing like I had just told him the most hilarious joke and he could not hold it in. After shaking that off, he shook his head and looked back at me and said, "No, mate, the station is closed. No more gas." And then motioned for me to get in my car to leave. I stood there for a moment, and thankfully, my brain finally clicked that he was telling me to get the hell out of there. I nodded, replaced the pump, and then told him to have a good evening and got back in my car. And as I did, I looked in my rearview mirror, and I watched this guy put his finger up to his head and motion as if he was shooting himself, and then start laughing again as he waved at me. I obviously took off from there, and it took a few moments for me to really get a grip on the whole thing. But I think he was basically telling me that if I came back, I was dead. I made a note of where I was and well, I left. Now, I'm not sure, but I think that his original plan was much more sinister than what he ended up doing. And I think my awkwardness may have saved me. Like, I made my comment, and it tickled him to the point that he felt bad, and he just thought, "Ah, I can't kill this pitiful idiot." Obviously, I have no idea if that's true, or if he was just willing to give me the opportunity to leave. And if I didn't, then he would take action. But I'm glad that he decided that I wasn't worth his time. Thankfully, that 5 gallons was more than enough to get me to my destinations and then get me back to the store to clock out. I made a note to never go back to that station. And I haven't, thankfully. If I have a delivery over in that direction, I fill up before I go that way just in case. I know it's not the creepiest of stories, but it definitely scared me. And like I said, I came out unscathed. But I feel like I was pretty close to something pretty terrible happening. Growing up in a small town has a certain charm and simplicity that can make a childhood feel like it exists in its own bubble. My town was one of those places that didn't have much, mostly farmland stretching out as far as the eye could see, a single school that catered to all the kids in the area, and a few family-owned shops. There wasn't much to do, but that simplicity was part of its appeal. We knew everyone, and everyone knew us, which made the idea of danger seem almost foreign. Out of all the places we could go, my favorite was the gas station that had a shop attached to it. It was probably the biggest shop in town, and the person who worked there as the clerk was a family friend. His presence always made me feel safe, like an extra layer of protection. My parents were comfortable enough to let me go there by myself, or sometimes with my little sister tagging along. Let's call her Emmy. The shop was only a 15-minute walk away from our house, a manageable distance that didn't stir up concerns. The gas station was a place people generally thought of as safe. Given that it was the social hub of our little town, it was rare to find a face that you didn't recognize. That sense of familiarity bred a kind of communal trust, an unspoken assurance that we were all looking out for each other. One scorching summer afternoon stands out in my memory though. I was 12 and Emmy was 7. I had just finished the chore that my mom had assigned to me, and as a reward, she handed me some cash. The sun was relentless that day, and the idea of getting an ice cream cone was too tempting to resist. I asked my mom for permission to go to the shop, and she agreed on the condition that I take Emmy along. She even gave me a couple of extra bucks for Emmy's ice cream. So, my sister and I set off down the familiar path without a worry in our minds. The sun was still high, bathing everything in a golden light. As we walked, we chatted about the mundane things the way that siblings do. The walk felt short, and soon enough, we reached the gas station. It was quieter than usual, but that wasn't entirely surprising given the time of day. However, something caught our eye. A red, shiny pickup truck parked near the gas pump. It looked brand new, like it had just been bought that day. This was unusual because most of the trucks and cars in our town were old and worn out. The newness of the truck made it stand out like a sore thumb. Our attention then shifted to the man pumping gas into the truck. He was a stranger, and in the town where everyone knew everyone, an unfamiliar face was immediately noticeable. He looked like he was in his late 20s, wearing a jean jacket, loose jeans, and a hat. And when he saw us, he took off his hat, revealing his unkempt oily hair, and then he gave us a smile that made my skin crawl. He waved hello, but there was something off about him that I couldn't quite put my finger on. I tried to ignore him, but Emily, being young and innocent, waved back. Well, that was all it took for the man to start talking to us. His initial questions were innocent though, how we liked the weather, what snacks we were planning to buy. His chatter didn't raise any immediate red flags, but there was just something sinister about him that set my instincts on edge, and I just could not figure out what it was. As the conversation progressed, he mentioned that he was new to the town and that he would love it if we showed him around. I declined his offer immediately, but he persisted. He said that he would buy us snacks if we promised that we would get into his truck and then show him the best places in town. I told him that there was nothing to see and that our parents were waiting for us to come back soon. He then offered to just drive us home after we were done buying snacks. There was something in the desperation in his voice that made my heart race. I kept glancing into the shop, hoping to see our family friend, the clerk, but he was nowhere to be seen, and I just feel the panic began to set in. Emily was still blissfully unaware of the danger and then continued to engage with the man. But my heart nearly stopped when I heard her scream. When I turned, I saw the man had grabbed her by her wrist and was trying to pull her toward the truck. Pure adrenaline surged through me. I ran to Emmy, grabbed her other hand, and started pulling her back while hitting the man and screaming for help. His grip on her wrist was tightening, and it was hurting my little sister, and she started crying. It felt like an eternity, but I held on with all my strength, driven by sheer terror and probably the adrenaline. And then I heard the door of the shop burst open. Our family friend came running out and punched the man in the face. The man let go of Emmy because of this, and I pulled her into the shop as fast as I could. Everything after that is a blur in my memory. I vaguely remember my mom arriving and the sheriff showing up shortly after. We went to the clinic too to get Emmy's wrist checked out. Long story short, our family friend was in the toilet doing his business when I couldn't see him. When he heard the screams, he came out as fast as he could. Then, he and the man exchanged some blows. Unfortunately, the creep managed to jump into his truck and then speed off while he was regaining his balance after getting a blow. He called the sheriff and then my mom, and she then arrived in minutes and stayed with us as we waited for the police. That day changed everything. From then on, my mom insisted on accompanying us whenever we wanted to go to the shop. We never saw that man again, thank goodness. I'm in my 30s now with a child of my own, and I've made sure to teach them about stranger danger. That experience left a mark on me, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong, even in a place that you consider safe. So, to the man in the red pickup truck who tried to get me and my sister into his truck, let's never meet again, ever. I was on a long drive trip a while back, heading to another state for a work event that I was pretty much told that I needed to be a part of. I was given the options to fly or to drive a rental car out there, and if I drove, I had to do it on a weekend and I wouldn't be paid for the mileage, which, whatever. I am terrified of flying, so I chose driving. There's no particular reason for me to be terrified of flying, but the 2 times that I've been on a plane, I have had the full-blown panic attacks that have ended in me vomiting. I think it's just me. I just get freaked out and I panic. So, obviously, I told my boss that I would get a rental and I would drive to the conference. The trip took way longer than I honestly anticipated, and I was driving pretty late into the night, and at the point where this event happened, I was running low on gas. I wasn't low enough that I would have ended up on the side of the highway, At least, I don't think so. But I was low enough that I made plans to fill up at the next station that I saw on the exit sign. I went for a while longer, so that there was a station at the next exit that indicated that it was open 24 hours, and I thought that I should consider stopping to use the restroom, get something to drink, and then fill up my tank. I pulled off, and after a bit of searching, I found the station. It was decently lit, so that wasn't a huge deal for me. But as I parked, I noticed that in the same parking lot as the station was what looked like an old motel that was boarded up. It kind of looked like a stereotypical old motel, 2 floors, 3 rooms on each floor, and then 1 extra room at the bottom that had the word office on it. A couple of the rooms were missing their doors, and some of them were just boarded up. Some of the windows looked smashed even. Honestly, it was a bit unsettling, but I wasn't here for the lodging. I was there for gas. I headed into the station, and it looked decent at the very least. Like, it was a bit dim, and a couple of the fluorescent bulbs were burned out, but the floor was clean and everything was well stocked. It wasn't a small station either. There was actually a good amount of space, and everything looked open, so it was kept up. There were 2 guys standing at the front counter talking to the clerk, and honestly, none of them looked too threatening. They just looked pretty normal. As I walked in, the clerk turned his attention to me, and he, very politely, asked me if he could help me find anything. I asked if he had a restroom, and then he motioned toward the back. I nodded, and then I headed back, and I did my business. As I was washing my hands though, I heard what sounded like all 3 men giggling like school children. At what, I don't know. But at the same time, people laughing isn't necessarily a bad thing or creepy. It was just something that I noted. When I walked out of the restroom, I could literally feel the 3 of them just staring at me as I went over to the cooler to get something to drink for the rest of the trip and also grabbed a snack. I thought that they would look away or break their stares as I walked toward the counter. But no, they all 3 just kept watching me as I approached. I tried my best to ignore it as the guys scanned my items. But after a few moments of my skin starting to crawl as the other 2 were glaring, I looked over toward them with a look like, "All right, I know you're staring. You can stop now." As soon as my attention was turned toward them, one of the guys took this opportunity to say, "We were making a bet on something, and we wanted to know, what would you rate me out of a 10? This caught me a bit off guard, and I wasn't really sure what to say. I just kind of scoffed and turned back toward the clerk. Unfortunately, he was in on their game, and he was just staring at me with his eyes wide, holding my Red Bull. At this point, I was just so annoyed, so I just said that I would like to pay for my stuff and go. And he told me that he would give me my things when I answered the question. I said that I wasn't interested in whatever this was, and that I would just like to pay and go. And once again, he laughed and said, No, not until you answer him." At this point, I decided that it wasn't worth my time to put up with this, and there were 3 of them versus 1 of me. I turned and I walked away from them. But as soon as I reached the door, I felt a hand reach out and grab my hip. Unfortunately for the person that grabbed me, which was the man that had asked me to rate him, as I was walking toward the door, I had actually unhooked my pepper spray from my keys, and I had a small cartridge that had a keyring on it, and he took the full blast of it to his face. The other 2 started yelling at me. He started screaming, and I turned and took off toward my car. Thankfully, The car had a push start, so I was able to get the engine going and get out on the road before the three of them could even get out into the parking lot. The whole time that I was pulling away and getting back onto the highway, I was looking back at my rear view, seeing that they weren't following me, which thankfully they weren't. After about 5 minutes of being back on the highway, I just pulled over and resituated myself, trying to calm down and get through the anxiety attack that was definitely hitting me. In the end, I was thankful that I had the mental wherewithal to grab my pepper spray while I was walking. I just had that feeling that one of them was going to try something. I ended up going for another half hour until I found a gas station in a much less creepy and much more populated area, and then I filled up without an issue. This was definitely the event that made it click that these things can happen to me, and that I am way more aware of my surroundings now. Before they started in on being a creep, I really didn't get any red flags. But even those that don't seem like creeps can be the worst. I'm not saying be paranoid and be scared of everyone, just that being prepared is always a good idea. I work the overnight shift at a gas station that is situated in a suburban area that isn't fully incorporated. And by that, I mean that there aren't houses everywhere, and there are quite a few spots that are dense forest. When you live and work near areas that are just trees like this, a lot of weird rumors and stories get thrown around, and this was no exception. I'd actually heard some dumb stories about the woods from coworkers. There was a rumor that they, whoever they were, had found a bunch of mutilated deer out there, and that a man had once been camping in the woods and got attacked by something. I don't know why a man would be camping in the woods behind a neighborhood, but it is what it is. They were just silly stories told by people to scare others. Of course, now I'm a bit more of a believer because of the fact that I saw something in those woods that I can't really explain. It was a pretty quiet night. We weren't very busy, so I was taking the opportunity to do some restocking and cleaning of some of the shelves that we had. As I was stocking some of the chips, I heard what sounded like a thud coming from where the dumpster was on the side of the building. Unfortunately, we'd had issues with a homeless guy that kept trying to sleep in our dumpster, and as much as I felt bad for the guy, I couldn't let him do that because the truck came for the dumpster at like 4 a.m, so if he was sleeping in it overnight, bad things could happen. I stepped outside to check it out, see if it was him again, and if it was, to tell him that he couldn't stay there. As soon as I stepped outside, I got hit with something I actually struggled to describe beyond a hit of adrenaline that sent chills down my spine. It was like I needed to be scared of something, and my body knew that I needed to be scared, but I didn't know what I needed to be scared of. I slowly turned toward where the dumpster was, and I really don't know what it was that I was looking at, but whatever it was, it had dropped the dumpster on its side and was tearing into the trash. I just sort of stood there staring at this nasty mass of fur that was eating the garbage. I think I was trying to place a name to this thing that I was seeing. Like, was it some kind of a dog, a wolf, or a coyote? But no, I can say with certainty that this thing was canine-like, but it was not a normal canine. Its body was lanky, like its limbs were extended like a person's, and it was way too large to be any sort of dog. It was like anything that I have ever seen before. If I had to put a number to it, I would say that it could have easily stood 6 foot tall. Its fur was matted and dirty and dark, and I could see that this thing had hellish claws on its hands or paws or whatever. After a few minutes of me just standing there and watching this thing, it noticed me and kind of just sniffed in my direction, but it ended up turning away and crawling back into the trees. I watched it as it went back into the forest and just kind of stood there watching me as I watched it, though it was probably just waiting for me to leave, and I was watching it because I was horrified. When I regained control of my legs, I ran back into the station and just stayed at the counter, pretending that this whole event never even happened, because I didn't want to think about the possibility of that thing being out there, lurking. I tried to rationalize what I saw numerous times, saying that it was a wolf, or maybe a really skinny bear, but I know for a fact that it was not. I don't know what it was, but I don't have a name for it other than creepy dog-looking cryptid thing. I'm sure that someone else will probably say what they think it was, and I welcome that because any information would help me. I haven't seen it since that night, and I still work the same shift, but it hasn't come back, thankfully. Though, I will say now, every time that I hear something out the back of the store messing with a dumpster, I tend to ignore it. I've worked at a small gas station in the middle of nowhere kind of town for quite a few years now. I used to work the day shift, but I decided that I would take the pay increase and lose my social life and work the overnight shift instead. Not like I had much of a social life to lose, to be honest. I've been married for about 10 years, and we don't exactly go out to parties or hang out with our friends or anything. Thankfully, my wife doesn't mind that I work the overnight shift, and we've made it work between the two of us. Honestly, the job has been incredibly uneventful for the years that I've worked it, with very little exception. Obviously, this is an event that is an exception. One important thing to note about this station is that we are mostly a 24/7 station, with a 1-hour exception each night for us to count down the drawer and do the receipt drop in the back. Basically, we close for 1 hour to mark the end of the day for the business and to pull the numbers. They used to not close to do it, but there was one point where the store was actually robbed by a former employee during the count because he knew the time that it was done, and the door was unlocked, so he took advantage of it. Ever since then, they've made it to where the store is closed for 1 hour every single night. It's a weird system, but it works in the end. On this night, I had closed down the store at 3 a.m. as I was scheduled to do, and I had counted down the drawer first, then did the receipt print for the cards. I had actually gotten it down in about 40 minutes, so I had 20 minutes until I needed to reopen, and I decided that I would go ahead and just take a few moments to myself behind the counter, kind of like a power nap kind of thing. Not really sleeping, but just doze off for the 20 minutes. A couple minutes after that I had sat and closed my eyes, I started hearing what sounded like a banging noise. It was enough to pull me out of my light nap and make me jump. I looked around at the door, and there was a woman that was smacking the door and pulling on it as hard as she could. At first, I instinctively started saying, "Oh, sorry, we're closed until 4. I can't unlock the door until then." But as I started talking, I could tell by the way she was frantically pulling at the door and staring at me that something was seriously wrong. Since I'd already counted down the drawer, I figured that I could let her in and at least see what the hell was going on. I walked around the counter and then unlocked the door and asked what I could help her with. She told me that her car had broken down a few blocks down the road, and that she was trying to get here so that she could have someone pick her up since she wasn't from around here. But she then said that for the last block or two, there was someone that was following her. Now, this was definitely a creepy story, but I was a bit skeptical at first. It almost felt like one of those stories that you would tell to scam someone or to get them to let their guard down. I actually asked her what she wanted me to do, and she said that she just wanted to come inside and call her husband so he could come get her. After a few moments of her reiterating things and me feeling like she was likely telling the truth, I decided to just let her in and lock the door. I told her that we weren't technically open, so I couldn't have her anywhere in the store other than the front. She said she understood and that she would stay at the front door and apologized for the whole thing, saying that she didn't mean to be a bother. She was just really scared about what the guy that was following her was planning on doing. At this point, I felt like she was leaning too heavy into the story to be lying to me, so I told her that it wasn't a bother and mentioned that if she sees him, I'll go ahead and call the cops for her. After a few minutes of her talking on her phone to who I am assuming was her husband, and then her waiting and just staring out the front door, she started making a bit of small talk, which was fine to me. I still had a couple of minutes before I could reopen, so I kind of welcomed the conversation. No sooner than we started just talking about whatever, I heard another loud sound, but this time, it wasn't just a person smacking the glass. It was the sound of something smashing the glass on the side door. Thankfully, the door was designed so that smashing it wouldn't allow access, as the glass was reinforced. It wasn't very wide and there were 4 metal bars across it, but this guy was seriously doing everything he could to smash the glass so that he could get in. Like, he was pretty clear in what he was trying to do. The woman screamed and I kind of yelped like, "What the hell?" And I turned to look at the scene in front of me. And after realizing what was happening, it occurred to me to hit the panic button. I know you're not supposed to hit them until the robber leaves in order to prevent a hostage situation, but I knew that he wasn't going to be able to get into the store with what he was doing. I'm sure this whole thing played out in like 10 seconds, but it felt like forever. Just standing there, watching this guy rapidly smashing the glass in the door and trying his hardest to get into the station. All the while, this woman is screaming that this is the guy that was following her. I'm telling her to get behind the counter and trying to figure out what the hell to do. I guess that the guy realized that he wasn't going to get it, and he just kind of stood there staring at the two of us with this horrible grin. Like, you could see the malice just pouring out of this guy, and he kept pointing at the two of us and shaking his head. It was terrifying. At no point did he say a word. He just stared, smiled, pointed, and shook his head back and forth, which felt more threatening than if he had been screaming at us. And then finally, I heard the sirens as the officers started to pull into the lot, and this guy took off behind the building and out of sight. A couple of the officers took after him, and another one came to the door to check on us. I went over and opened it, and, well, that was a fun time, explaining to him and the owner when he showed up what the hell had gone on. The woman explained her side, I told them my side, and it was pretty much the same, honestly. She had no idea who this guy was, and I obviously didn't know him too. This was just some dude that was an absolute psycho and had ill intentions with this poor woman. The officers waited for her husband to show up to come get her, and I ended up having a long night with them and the owner going over everything. We were going through the footage on the cameras. The owner wasn't too happy that I let her in during our closed hour, but I straight told him that if I hadn't, this guy would have gotten to her, and that would have been worse than a bit of property damage. Thankfully, this was the most eventful situation that I've had on this job, and I hope that it stays that way. I don't know if they ended up catching the guy or if he got away from that night, but I never saw him after that, nor did I ever see her too. I was definitely a bit nervous to go back to work the next day, but it was just normal operations after that. I did have to explain to a few of our regulars what happened to the door, which got old, but it is what it is. So, to that lady, I do hope that you're doing okay and this didn't traumatize you too much. And to that guy, I hope you and I never meet again, you absolute psycho. My name is Lily, and I'm a college student working part-time at a gas station to make ends meet. I've always struggled with insomnia, and instead of spending my nights tossing and turning, I decided that it would be better to work the overnight shift. It seemed like a practical solution, allowing me to earn some money while keeping my mind occupied. The gas station is a small 24-hour joint located on the outskirts of town. Most nights are quiet, with only the occasional customer stopping by to either fuel up or grab a snack. I usually spend my time behind the counter, flipping through my textbooks or browsing the internet when the store is empty. The steady hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint buzz of the refrigerators have become the soundtrack to my nights. One night, at around 1 a.m., I was behind the counter trying to focus on my reading. The station was empty, and the silence was almost comforting. The door chime rang and I looked up to see a man walk in. He was wearing a large, dirty green coat that looked like it hadn't been washed in years. His hair was unkempt, and he had a fidgety demeanor, constantly shifting his weight from one foot to another. As part of my job, I greeted him with a polite, "Good evening, sir." But instead of replying, he just stared at me. His eyes lingered on mine for a little too long, and it made me feel uneasy. But I just tried to brush it off, telling myself that he was probably just as tired or distracted. And without saying a word, he turned and started walking through the aisles, his eyes scanning the shelves. I watched as he picked up a few bags of chips, examined them, and then put them back. But after a few minutes, he finally came up to the counter and then placed several bags of chips in front of me. He smiled, but there was something off about it. His lips curled up, but his eyes remained cold and weird. He then asked me about the cigarettes, which were stored behind the counter for safety reasons. I nodded, and I turned around to get them. As I reached for the pack, I heard the crinkling sound of a chip bag being opened. I turned back quickly to see that he had opened one of the bags and was eating the chips. I said, "Sir, you need to pay for those before you eat them." I was trying to keep my voice steady. He chuckled, a creepy, unsettling sound that sent shivers down my spine. "Oh, okay," he said, putting the half-eaten bag back on the counter. I handed him the pack of cigarettes and I asked for his ID. He reached into his jacket to get his wallet, but as he did, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Tucked into his pants was a gun. My heart started racing, and I felt a surge of fear and panic. He saw me staring and then asked, "What, see something you like?" Before giving me a wink, I was both disgusted and terrified. I was trying to keep my composure, and I checked his ID, my hands trembling slightly. He went to pay for the items, but he was a bit short on cash. His expression darkened, and he looked very upset. He then asked if I could cover for him, I initially started to refuse him. I said, "I don't think that," and then I was cut off by the man slamming his fist against the counter. He had a stone cold look in his eyes, and I jumped, startled by the sudden act of violence. At that point, I just decided to go along with it. The fear of what he might do next was overwhelming me, and I said, "Okay, just pay what you have and I'll cover the rest." My voice barely audible. He smiled, a sinister glint in his eyes, and said, "Well, that's a good girl." He then took the items and left, giving me one last wink before walking out the door. I stood there, shaken and disgusted. My mind was racing. I couldn't believe what just happened. The man's presence had been unsettling from the moment he walked in, but seeing the gun and the way he had interacted with me left me feeling vulnerable and scared. I hoped to never see him again. The rest of my shift was a blur. I couldn't focus on anything, my thoughts consumed by the encounter that just happened. Every time that the door chime rang, my heart would skip a beat, fearing that he had come back and probably take more things. Or maybe finally shoot me, I don't know. But finally, when my shift ended, I clocked out as quickly as I could, and then I headed home, still shaken by the experience. Over the next few nights, I became increasingly paranoid. Every time a new customer walked in, I would tense up, my mind flashing back to the man in a dirty green coat. I couldn't shake the feeling of fear that he had left behind. I reported the incident to my manager, who assured me that they would increase security. I don't really know what they meant by that. It's not like we had a security guard or something, and we never hired one. And they also said that they would keep an eye out for the man. But the fear never truly went away. I just tried to focus on my job and my studies, but it was always on the back of my mind. Months passed and I never saw the man again, thankfully. The gas station remained quiet, other than a few other awkward encounters, but not as dangerous as that one. To this day, I don't know what happened to the man in the dirty green coat, but the memory of that night, the fear, the vulnerability, the thoughts of what would have happened if I didn't go along with what he said, or if he asked for something else, will haunt my mind forever. So, to the man in the dirty green coat, you're sick. Let's not meet again. Nowhere near as creepy as the other stuff that I have read on here, but still very strange, and I have no idea. Me and my mate D, both 17, are both cruising around our local area in his new car. Important to note that D had not passed his test nor had insurance, therefore we usually drove at around 2 to 3 in the morning. We pull up to our local petrol station to get some fags. I had a goatee and I didn't get ID'd, so we came here often. As we pull in, this pretty built dude asks us to roll down our window. We roll down and get chatting to him, and then he tells us that his wife is very angry at him because he's been on a bender and can't get home and is desperate for a lift back. Then he offers us 500 euros for a lift to a city that is only 40 to 50 minutes away. I would be lying if I didn't say that our dumb 17-year-old brains immediately thought that this was an easy payday. But then, the reality set in that we are driving illegally. But we didn't want to tell him that obviously, so we politely declined. But he then gets really insistent that we have to give him a lift, like really insistent. I finally realize that surely he can just get a taxi. The guy working in the garage would definitely call him one, and it's not like he's short on cash, nor would the taxi even break 100 euros. So I say this to him, and he genuinely has no answer to it and just insists that we should give him a lift. The actual conversation actually went on for almost 20 minutes, but unfortunately, I can't remember the other details. I offered to book him a cash taxi, and after many attempts of convincing him on how much cheaper it is, he then accepts. We say that we are leaving now as we were both weirded out, and he just turns to us and says, "You guys are fucking idiots." But we just kinda smile and then start driving. Out of nowhere, a guy, even bigger built, runs at our car and just throws his drink all over on D through the open window. Obviously, D is fuming and jumps out of the car and I follow. We walk up to the guy, and the guy that was talking to us is profusely apologizing for his mate's actions. I remind D that we are driving illegally, and the last thing that we want to do is to get into a fight and the police be called. So, we get back in, drive off and cancel his taxi. The rest of the night, we were just trying to make sense of what just happened. It just never sat right with me. I don't know why he was so insistent. Maybe so that when we got there, he could just jump out and run, so he gets a free lift for him and his mate. Also, it could have been to rob the car. But then, knocking out two fully grown lads for a beat-up dinger just seems a lot of effort. I've always been genuinely curious as to what would have happened if we accepted, and how bad of a situation it could have been. Life hasn't been easy for me lately. With bills piling up and my day job barely covering the essentials, I had to find a way to make ends meet. So, when I saw the "Help Wanted" sign at the local gas station, I figured that it was a godsend. The position was for the overnight shift, and while it wasn't ideal, beggars can't be choosers, right? The extra income was crucial, so I took the job without a hesitation. The gas station is a small, unassuming place located on the outskirts of town. It's the kind of place where you wouldn't expect much to happen, especially during the quiet hours of the night. My duties were straightforward: keep an eye on the pumps, restock the shelves, clean the store, and then handle the register. It was monotonous work, but it allowed me to catch up on my thoughts and sometimes even squeeze in a bit of reading when things were really slow. I'd been working there for a couple of months now, and everything seemed pretty standard. Most nights were uneventful, if not downright boring. Occasionally, I would have to deal with an odd grumpy drunk customer or a tweaker looking to buy snacks, but nothing too out of the ordinary. The isolation was something that I even started to appreciate, a peaceful break from the chaos of my daytime life. But then, there was one night that shattered the routine and left me unnerved in a way that I never thought possible. It was an unusual quiet night, even for the gas station. I had just finished restocking the chips, and I was about to settle behind the counter when I saw a large car pull into the lot. It was a bigger model, the kind that stands out in a town like ours, where most people drive older, more practical vehicles. 5 men got out of the car. Each of them looked like they were in their 30s, wearing different styled clothes, but all in the same color, black. On the upper left corner of their outfits, there was a small symbol, something that looked like a triangle with an eye in the center, which was also encased in a circle. I'm sorry, I don't quite remember, but it had an eerie cult-like vibe to it, and it made me feel uneasy right from the start. But oh well, I didn't mind it as much. Probably just a fashion statement, I thought to myself. They walked into the store and began picking out snacks, chatting among themselves. I tried to focus on my task, but I couldn't help but glance at them periodically. There was something about their presence that felt intrusive. They also kept glancing back at me. As they finished gathering their items, they all approached the counter at once. The way they huddled together was so intimidating, overwhelming even. At first, they seemed friendly enough, making small talk as I scanned their snacks. But even after I completed the transaction, they lingered. Their questions began to feel invasive and overwhelming. They asked about my background, my interest, my schedule. The questions kept coming, and I found it hard to escape the barrage. Despite my discomfort, I remained polite, giving shorter and sometimes single-word answers, hoping that they would take the hint and leave me alone. The men then took turns talking about how good their lives had become ever since they joined what they referred to as a support group. Yeah, that's what they called it. They spoke reverently about their leader who had apparently taught them so much and then transformed their lives. They described how they all lived together, ate together, and worshiped together. And in my brain, I was like, worship? It was starting to creep me out. The more they talked, the more it sounded like they were describing a cult, but a modern one at that. My anxiety grew as they started pushing me to join their group, to check it out, insisting on the benefits and how it could change my life too. I declined, saying that I wasn't interested at all, but they kept pushing, their tone becoming more insistent. One of the men seemed to get angry at my refusal. His fake friendly facade was cracking, and he was about to reveal his true self. And I literally felt that I was in danger at that moment. And just when I thought that I might cave in under the pressure, I hear 2 trucks pull into the lot. I recognized them as regulars who often came in at this hour. The sight of the familiar faces seemed to disrupt whatever sinister intentions the men had. They stopped their aggressive pitch and reluctantly made their way out of the store. But before they all left, one of them looked back at me and said, "We will be seeing you around," in a tone that sent a chill down my spine. As they drove off, I felt a wave of relief but also an undertone of lingering dread. The rest of the night passed uneventfully though, but I couldn't shake off what had happened. My mind raced with questions. What did those men want from me? Were they really trying to recruit me in some kind of cult? And if so, why me? The thought of seeing them again filled me with a sense of deep unease. Since that night, I've been on high alert during my shifts. Every time a car pulls into the lot, my heart skips a beat. I haven't seen those men again though, thankfully. But it still made me wary of strangers and taught me to be more cautious, even in a place that I once considered safe. I don't know what those men were truly after, and I pray that I never find out. To those modern cult men, I hope we never meet again. Back in the 1990s, I used to work as an advertising executive in Baltimore when I lived in New York City every day. The commute was really tiring, but I really enjoyed my job. I would wake up around 6 in the morning, would take the 3 train to Penn Station, and when I arrived there, I would usually catch a 7:15 Amtrak, and the train ride would normally be 2 hours and 15 minutes. I would do this every day without any problems. Only this one day would put a sad end to this streak. It was a Friday morning, and I hopped on a 6:15 3 train like every day. There was no issue so far. Around 6:23, we then arrived at the third to last stop before entering Manhattan, and then we took off from that train station about a minute later. Around 6:26 or 6:27, the train came to a complete stop. I was surprised because trains wouldn't usually stop this early in the morning as less people took the train at this time. I waited for about 5 minutes before the conductor came on the speaker and said, "We're extremely sorry for the delay. There is an issue going on and we're trying to resolve this ASAP. Thank you for your patience." I was annoyed because I didn't want to be late for work, as my boss would lose his shit if anyone was late. Time kept going by, and now I was on the train for like 40 minutes. Now, I was getting concerned. What the hell could be going on out there? 20 minutes later, the conductor came on the speaker again and said, "We are all so sorry that we're being held here for this long. We're expected to be here for a while now. Thank you for your patience." An hour had already passed by, and everyone in the subway car started to get very anxious and grumpy. And 10 minutes later, I would have the most disturbing moment of my life. Right outside of my subway car, I heard a bunch of gunshots and yelling. Someone must have had intentions of killing somebody. I was so frightened at this moment that I could only sit and wait until the train would move again. Everyone else in the car felt the same way. For like the next 35 minutes, I would hear constant sirens above me. Every police department in the city had to have been called. I would also hear loud talking outside of the car, and I could tell a huge crime scene was going on. Time still flew by, and I was still stuck in the tunnel. Around 8:30-ish, the train finally moved again and everybody cheered happily so loudly. There was still no signals as we were still underground. And we then arrived at the next stop and we were all forced to exit the train as the whole line would be shut down for the remainder of the day. I then called my boss and told him that I wouldn't be coming to work today, and I explained to him what exactly had happened. He then said that it was all good and hoped that I was safe and sound. After getting off the phone and then walking up to the police officer, I asked him what happened. He told me that they couldn't tell anybody what the situation is and that I would have to find out in tomorrow's newspaper. I said thank you, and I then walked out of the station and hailed a taxi all the way back home. The next morning, I went outside of my apartment front door to grab my newspaper. I picked it up, and what I read on the front page, I felt as if my heart went into my stomach. On Thursday night, a homeless man stole a gun from a gun shop and ran off. Nobody was able to catch him as he ran so fast. Later, he would enter a train station not too far from my station and then would jump on the tracks and run away as witnesses said. He then hid from the police between multiple stops from night until morning, and it was at the station that I stopped around the time that I was on the train that a security guard working behind the surveillance cameras spotted a homeless man on the tracks and then informed the train conductor about this, which resulted in the train stopping for an estimated 2 hours and 30 minutes. During this gruesome time period, the police were called and they kept searching for the man everywhere until the police and us heard gunshots from underneath the train and the cops fired back at the man. He was immediately killed after being shot. It then took a while before the other police and EMTs arrived at the scene and then carried the dead body of the homeless man in a body bag. About 5 years later, I quit that job because I got a higher paying job offer that was in the city and I didn't have to commute all the way down to Baltimore. After this scary incident, I am extremely afraid of guns, and whenever I see one at a store or on TV, the memory keeps playing back in my head of when I heard shots fired right outside and underneath the subway car that I was in. This event happened in late 2004. It was my senior year in high school and I couldn't wait to graduate. I went to a school called Winston Prep, which is located in the Union Square area in New York City. It was a special education school that goes from 6th to 12th grade. At an early age, I was diagnosed with severe ADHD and OCD. Some others had Asperger's or autism, excluding severe autism. I would mostly talk to the people who were like me because we could understand social cues and be more normal than the others. My school never went by grades but rather by disability, and we would have the same learning classes with the same exact people. I would mostly get along with everyone in my class. Everyone in my class was pretty friendly and acted normal. But there was this one guy who was really messed up in the head. His name was Quentin. I always saw him as a weird kid because he didn't have that many friends and he would always stare at people, which included me. But besides that, I didn't really have any problem with him because he was a pretty chill dude, as I thought he was, and I could actually have a conversation with him. There was this one day when my history teacher was talking about the 2004 presidential election because it was coming up, and George W. Bush was running again for president for the Republican Party. And I am not trying to stereotype politics here, but Republicans aren't that strict when it comes to gun laws. Anyways, the teacher asked the whole class, "So, who do you want to win for president? George W. Bush for the Republican Party or John Kerry for the Democratic Party?" When it was Quentin's turn, he said that he wanted Bush to win. He gave his reasons, but his main reason is gun laws. He said everyone should protect themselves if they're armed with guns. He then told the whole class that he owned a BB gun and plans on bringing it to school one day. We all laughed and thought that he was actually joking. And later on in the semester, that turned out not to be the case. One day, Quentin didn't come to class. I thought he was just sick, but I turned out to be wrong. It was 10 in the morning on a Tuesday, and I was already in my second class of the day. The day started off how it usually would, but 5 minutes into the class, we heard the lockdown siren go off. The teachers would usually inform us that we would have a lockdown drill or a fire drill that day before the drill itself. But I knew for a fact that this was not a drill because they never informed us the day before. About 10 minutes into the lockdown, I heard a bunch of commotion outside of my classroom. I didn't know what was going on because the blinds were shut and we weren't supposed to know because a real-life lockdown was taking place. I also kept hearing a bunch of lockers slamming as if someone was getting pushed onto them. After that, we heard the stairway door open and then there was silence. I would say like 3 minutes later, the principal announced on the loudspeaker that the lockdown was over and that the school would be closing early that day because of our safety. I then exited the school and I turned on my flip phone. I had a flip phone because this was before Samsungs and the iPhones came out. I would have it off during school because I didn't want to get it confiscated and I wanted to learn in school. I got a text from my friend saying, "Dude, this is crazy. Quentin just got arrested for bringing a BB gun to school." And I remember a month earlier that he said that he planned on bringing it one day. Everyone thought that it was a joke, but he sure as hell was not joking. I didn't know what intentions he had with that gun, but logically, it was something not good. I was able to finish my senior year strong, and I am currently an English teacher at a middle school. I don't know where Quentin is today, and to be honest, I don't really care. But I am 85% sure that his life went nowhere to this day. I was a junior at George Mason University in Virginia in 2022. I have since graduated last spring with a degree in musical theater. I stayed another year because of credit issues. During 2021 to 2024, I worked as an RA to keep myself productive. I enjoyed my job at times because I would throw events as RAs could do that, and I would also talk to other residents who live in the dorms. Other times, I would enjoy it. The 2022 spring semester was coming right up, and I moved in a day earlier because I was told to. The next day then came, and people were moving in. It was a busy day, and I was tired of walking around and helping people move in, and I barely got to sit down. Around 3 in the afternoon, a kid named Brandon arrived and was ready to move in. I introduced myself, checked him in, and he was all settled in. But something about him made me feel a little off. He seemed very socially awkward, and I assumed that he was somewhat on the spectrum. But that didn't really bother me. I didn't worry about it too much, and I just helped everyone else move in for the rest of the day. It was now March, and I was having a pretty great semester to say the least. I got a part that I wanted that I auditioned for. I made a lot of new friends, and more importantly, I was getting good grades. We would rehearse every day, and one day, a band joined the rehearsals. Once they came, I saw who everyone in the band was. One face that I recognized in that band. It was Brandon, a guy who dormed in the building that I worked in. He was the drummer for the band, and I felt impressed that there was someone that I knew outside of my classes that I would be seeing now regularly, considering how big the college actually is. When we were rehearsing together, he would continuously stare at me. I felt really uneasy, but I would just pretend that I didn't notice that he stared at me. I figured that he must have a crush on me. We were together for, I would say, like a month and a half, and then we had our show, and that was that. I was so happy that we had finally finished with that play for 2 reasons. 1, we worked our asses off, and now we could have free time. And 2, that boy Brandon won't have to stare at me anymore. I would still have to see him though, because he stayed in the same building as me while working as an RA. It was now late April, and there were like 2 weeks left of school. Nothing happened for the next week, but a week later, something happened that never in a million years that I thought would have ever happened to me. On a Thursday night, it was my turn to work as the RA. Nothing happened for an hour, everything was chill, and I was on my phone scrolling through Instagram. But all of a sudden, I heard footsteps approaching me, and when I turned my head up, I saw pure horror. Right in front of me was Brandon. This time, he was completely naked, and worst of all, he was smiling at me. I couldn't believe what my eyes were seeing. I then was sending blow-up texts to all of my friends in a group chat about what was going on. As I was doing that, I then heard another pair of footsteps. It was his roommate, Steven. He was running and he begged me not to call the resident hall director. I said okay, and I saw him literally pulling and dragging Brandon to their room, and then they went out of view. I was still processing what was going on, and I decided that I will take a short walk to clear my brain. I listened to Steven and I didn't call the resident hall director. Saturday then came, and Brandon moved out that day. I had to act normal for my job. I saw his dad come to help him move out, and I helped him as well. Although I didn't tell my boss what he did, I did tell his dad. I expected him to completely lose it at Brandon, but he quite frankly did the complete opposite. He assured me that he just has autism and that he isn't harmful. Using autism as an excuse for what he did is unacceptable. Most autistic people would not do that as far as my knowledge, unless you have severe autism. The only thing that I could think of was that he had an episode. I then checked Brandon out, and then he and his father left. I now felt peace as they were gone. I told a few friends what had happened, and they told me something even more devastating. A formal dance took place 2 weeks ago, and I didn't end up going. At the dance, Brandon apparently took pictures under numerous girls' skirts, which included some of my friends. No girl knew about this until one guy told this to every girl who fell victim. I was extremely disgusted to hear this. But I never saw Brandon after this. He either left school or moved to another campus. The scene of him keeps replaying in my head every day, and I had to immediately see a therapist after this. I was so traumatized, but I'm pretty relieved that I didn't see him again, and I would want to keep it that way. When I was a kid, there were a group of us kids that pretty much spent every day of our childhood together. For the most part of it was myself, Chuck, and Billy, and the three of us were like brothers. We did everything together. We camped in each other's backyards and spent way too many hours of our days off together. Billy ended up moving away sophomore year, but beyond that, we literally grew up together, from elementary school through the years we all graduated. And Billy actually came back home so we could all have a party when he and Chuck finished high school. My point with that is that we were inseparable best friends, and we are still in touch with each other. Now, while the three of us were obviously really close, there was a fourth person in our group for a while, and that was a little girl named Katie. Katie had lived in our block for a few years before we met, and the whole time I knew her, it was just her and her dad that lived at that house. He was a single parent, and none of us had met her mother. Katie was my age, so a year older than the other two. And she was nothing short of a bit strange, though we did end up figuring out why when all was said and done. And nowadays, I actually feel bad for how we treated her for being weird. I met Katie when I was around 8. She was, to the best of my knowledge, the only girl in the neighborhood that was in our age range. So when we met, it was pretty obvious that she was going to latch onto our trio. We were 8 and 9-year-old boys, so we were a bit annoyed that there was going to be a girl with us since we were still at that age where girls were a foreign concept. At first, Katie was fine with the three of us though. She was interested in some of the things that we were, and she was willing to play our dumb games. We would sword fight with our toy swords, and she was willing to jump in and take a few hits. And she could actually hold her own. She was interested in animals, so she was willing to help me dig up my yard to look for bugs. Basically, she was one of us for the most part. Except when she wasn't herself. Katie was fine probably 95% of the time. But then, sometimes, she would just be a bit out there. Like she was a completely different person. Those times where she would be different, she would sometimes get violent or angry or just really, really strange. I know that's vague, and I'm not going to get into all the instances where things were wrong, but I will explain a few of them. The first event of note was one day when we were at Chuck's house and we were taking turns playing a game on his Super Nintendo. That was typically something we did once a week, and we weren't allowed to stay cooped up in the house every day, so it was always super exciting for all of us. I think we were playing one of the Mario games, I'm not sure which one, and then it was Katie's turn. Katie wasn't great at the game, but she usually took her losses with grace and just laughed about it each time that she messed up. But not this time. This time she was playing, and she misjudged the jump and then ended up dying. Obviously, when this happened, we all chuckled as we did when one of us made a mistake and died. But she didn't. She had a flat stare and then she stood up, and by the time the game took us back to the level select screen, Katie had literally jumped up and stomped down on the Nintendo. She smashed it with all of her body weight, and while the console was mostly okay, the game ended up bending and snapping in half. Obviously, we all freaked out, and Chuck started bawling his eyes. This Super Nintendo was his pride and joy. Katie then looked over at Chuck and then put her hands around his throat, literally choking him, and she was telling him to stop crying, that he needed to grow up, and that he wasn't a baby, and that if he wanted to cry, then she would give him something to cry about. Billy and I jumped into action, and we pulled her away from Chuck, leaving this whole situation a confusing disaster, and Chuck sitting there looking horrified. Chuck's dad came in to figure out what happened, and we had to explain to him what Katie had done. Strangely enough, Katie actually agreed with our statements, and she was willing to own what happened. She said she was angry and that she wanted to destroy it, so she did. She said that Chuck was crying over nothing and that he needed to grow up. I honestly don't know what really happened after that, because Chuck's dad told us to go home. But I do know that Katie's dad bought him a new game, and Katie wasn't really allowed at Chuck's house anymore after that happened. In fact, I don't think Chuck and Katie really spent any time together after this, for good reason. I don't want to really get into all the events that Katie caused, because this story would go on for ages, but I do want to go over one of the last things that ended up happening, the thing that I think may have actually caused Katie to be a bit odd. This was around a year after the whole thing with Chuck happened. I was on my own that day, and I went out into the woods that were behind our neighborhood. I was out there pretending that I was some kind of adventurer. And who else would I see but Katie? I went over to talk to her, but as I approached, I noticed something weird. Katie was sitting on the ground, her back against a tree, was eating a sandwich while just talking to no one in particular. I walked up to her to ask her who she was talking to, and when she noticed me, she jumped and screamed that I shouldn't be there. I was obviously taken aback and scared, and I asked what I had done wrong. She then started going on about how I was upsetting her mother, how she was having dinner with her, and I wasn't invited. I kind of just looked around and mentioned that she was alone, that her mother wasn't there. But that was definitely the wrong thing to say, because then Katie flipped out. She started screaming at me aggressively that her mother lived in the woods, that I wasn't allowed to be anywhere near her mother, and that I needed to go home before she hurt me. Again, I was confused, but I just said that I was sorry and that I didn't know. Strangely enough, Katie shifted from psychotic and ready to pounce to almost sympathetic. She said that it was okay, that if I was really sorry, that she wouldn't be mad at me anymore and that I was welcome to sit with them. I hesitantly agreed with her, mostly because I will admit that at this time in our relationship, I actually did have a crush on her. So sitting with her was something that I was more than willing to do. Yes, I had a crush on Katie, in spite of her random strange behavior. I sat at one of the trees and I just watched her eat her sandwich and talk. She was talking about school, about all the things that she was going through, and what she was going to be doing that week. She was talking to no one in particular, like she was basically telling her mother about her life. I was a bit curious, so I waited for an opening, and I actually asked her where her mother was. Well, this is where things turned to haunting. Katie looked at me and started crying, like full-on sobbing. I kind of freaked out. I didn't mean to make her cry, So I scooted over to her and I gave her a big hug and I asked her what was wrong. Katie then pulled away and told me that her mother lived in the woods because one night she and her father got into an argument and her dad hurt her. I will say that we were 10, so this was a whole new thing to me. My parents were always happily married, so I didn't understand the situation of my dad hurt my mom. That idea was just impossible to me. I asked how he hurt her, why he hurt her, and so forth, basically interrogating this poor crying girl. And she stopped crying, pulled away from me, and she told me something that made my blood run cold. She looked me in the eyes and said, "My mom's not really living out here. She's dead. My dad killed her. He killed her and then buried her out here in the woods. I saw him do it. He doesn't know that I saw, though. He doesn't know that I know what he did. He doesn't know that I watched him choke her until she died. He doesn't know that I watched him dig that hole and then bury her. I watched him do it." She kind of started just rambling all of this and shifting between crying and not crying. And looking back, she was clearly traumatized. I honestly think that this is what caused her to be strange and aggressive. She saw this horrifying event and didn't know how to process it. Of course, I told my parents what she said, but being my age, I didn't know what else to do, but I told them what she said to me. Of course, my parents called the cops and they reported what Katie had said, and all of it was this huge mess. The cops ended up doing an investigation, talking with Katie about everything, taking reports from her and her father and asking me about everything. And then they did the excavation. This is where things went from weird to absolutely devastating. They dug up the spot in the woods and they actually did find the body of a woman. Katie wasn't lying or making any of it up. Her dad had actually killed her mother, and he actually did bury her in the woods, which tells me that she really did watch this all play out. To wrap this up, Katie ended up leaving town to live with someone else in her family. Her father was arrested, and all of this was my fault because she trusted me and I told my parents. Obviously, I did the right thing. Her mother deserved justice, and looking back at it as an adult, not telling anyone would have been the worst thing to do. That said, I will never let go of the fact that I changed a huge portion of her life. She was a weird girl, but she was my friend, and I did like her, and because I told my parents what she told me, her whole life changed direction. I never saw her again. And that day where she told me about what happened was the last time that we ever spoke. I never got to say goodbye or anything. I do hope that her life went back to normal after this, as normal as it could be. I hope that she found peace because she deserved it, and I hope that someday she and I can talk again so I can tell her that I am sorry for all the things that she went through. Katie, if you ever read or hear this story, please know that I have never forgotten you, and I mention your name every single time that I pray. Hi everyone, my name is Valerie, and this is something that happened to me a few years ago. Like many young people starting college, I was both excited and nervous. I had gotten into the university that I wanted, but it was a 2-hour drive from my home. Commuting for 4 hours every single day was not something that I wanted to do. So, after getting permission from my dad, I started searching for a place closer to school. For 2 days, I scoured the area, but I found nothing within my budget. Most apartments were too expensive. And finally, I stumbled upon a place that was cheap and conveniently located. The catch? It was near an abandoned hospital. Well, I didn't really care much for that, creepy or scary places never bothered me. Ever since I was young, I'd experienced unexplainable things, so this was nothing to me. I would also like to mention that I had a boyfriend at that time, and my boyfriend was someone who could see things that others couldn't, if you know what I mean. The first couple of months went by smoothly. The university was great and I loved my classes. My boyfriend and I were comfortable passing by the abandoned hospital too. We mostly walked by it in the morning, maybe late afternoon, or the early evening, but nothing ever strange happened. But one night, my school hosted a pageant. It was an event open to outsiders, so I invited my boyfriend to join me. The activities wrapped at around 2 a.m., and we decided to head to my place. It was a 15-minute walk, and we had to pass by the hospital. I didn't really think much of it, and he didn't too, because we've passed by there multiple times and nothing ever creeped us, spooked us out, or happened to us. But as we got closer to the hospital, a strange feeling crept over me. It was hard to describe. I was about to mention it to my boyfriend when I noticed him staring intently at something. He seemed focused, almost as if he were holding his breath, bracing himself. His grip on my hand also tightened. I tried asking what was wrong, but he didn't respond. When we were near the hospital, he then whispered to me, "Val, walk faster." His voice was tense and low. I did as he said, though I was confused. Something about his demeanor unsettled me. I was about to glance back when he said, No, don't look back, just walk faster." I have always been a bit stubborn, so despite his warning, I looked back. But there was no one there. I couldn't see anything at all. My boyfriend was sweating at this time and we picked up our pace to a jog. He then tried to explain to me and said that a woman was following us. As I mentioned before, I didn't see anyone or anything when I turned around, and that's when I understood that this woman that he is talking about is something that he can only see. He then glanced back and then looked at me. Fear etched across his face. He said, "Run." I had never seen him like this before. He was scared out of his wits, so we ran, sprinting the rest of the way to my house. And once inside, I quickly locked the door and we collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. My boyfriend finally told me what he had seen. He said that it was a woman in white standing near the hospital. At first, he thought she was just a passerby, until she looked up and then he saw her eyes. They were completely black. He knew that something was off, and as we passed her, she started following us. She moved unnaturally, and that's when he told me to run. Even though I continued to walk by the hospital until I graduated, I made sure never to do it late at night. That experience was enough to teach me to trust my instincts and my boyfriend's gift. I learned to respect the things that we couldn't understand, and while I never saw that woman myself, the memory of my boyfriend's fear is something that I will never forget. This morning was the worst morning of my life, and let me tell you why. I woke up at around 7 in the morning like I always do for work. I turned off my alarm and then I swiped to unlock my phone. After unlocking my phone, I went to my camera app to see if I had any pimples on my face because I was too lazy to go check in the mirror as I was still waking up. Then, I went from 10 to 100 real quick when I saw an image or video at the bottom left on the screen. I don't remember having this on my camera because the last time that I took a photo was 3 days ago, and I remembered exactly what I took a photo of. When I clicked on it, I saw that it was a video. I pressed play, and when I watched this video, I felt as if my whole world was coming to an end. The video shows someone entering my room, walking up to my bed, and then coming right next to me. This person then clearly kneeled down, and it showed my face facing the camera, capturing me sleeping and snoring. I felt like I was going to vomit after watching it. I'm very surprised that I didn't wake up from this. I tend not to be that deep of a sleeper. This person was most likely an intruder. I then walked around my whole apartment and checked if anything was stolen. Thankfully, nothing was stolen. But I also saw that I accidentally forgot to lock my door after I came home, and I felt like a complete idiot not doing this. What person could do this thing? This person just walked through my apartment, came into my room, grabbed my phone, walked out of my door, only to come back and take a video of me sleeping. I texted all my friends asking if they did this just to mess and play a joke on me. But everyone responded with a firm no, and I believed all of them. I felt more of an idiot for not having any sort of passcode or face ID on my phone. I then changed that after eating my breakfast. I then went to my Photos app and checked if this was actually recorded on my phone. I then went to the media type section, and it said that it was airdropped to my phone. I decided that I would not report this to the police because there was nothing that they could really do. After all, I do live alone with no security cameras, and I simply just forgot to lock the door. I then got myself together and I went on about the rest of my day, pretending like it never had happened. I don't know what the intruder's goal was for recording a video of me sleeping and not stealing anything in my apartment. It's very strange to say the least. Maybe they were just trying to scare me and have me intimidated every night. I hope not. I'm about to go to sleep now, and I hope something like this doesn't happen again this morning. This time, I remembered to lock my door. However, I am still paranoid that this will happen again sometimes, and I have a bold assumption that this person never left my apartment and is still hiding somewhere as I speak. This was something that happened when I was around 4 or 5 years old. Of course, I know I was really young, so I didn't have all the details. So this was also put together with the help from my dad, as it involved the two of us. I remembered parts of this from my perspective, but I'll also include what my dad saw and experienced, so I apologize if it does jump around some. This was sometime in the early 90s. My family, which was my mom, my dad, my baby sister, and I, lived near the border of Oklahoma and Texas. My dad had gotten a phone call about his mom falling ill, and they were afraid that she wouldn't make it much longer, so he wanted to go be with her in Mexico. Both of my parents were working full-time jobs, so they were kind of stuck. My mom wouldn't be able to watch both of us while working, but they also couldn't afford to have us all go, so they decided that my dad would take me with him since I was older, and my mom would stay at home with my sister since she was a newborn anyways and could bring her with her to work. So my mom made us some food for the road, and after packing a bag for both of us and bringing my favorite toys, we headed out late one night. That way, we could get through a lot of driving while I slept, plus it was a little cooler. It was the middle of summer, and it was unbearably hot. The AC was barely working, and we couldn't have it on at all times. Otherwise, the car would start running funny. We also had a very old car that could fall apart at any time, so driving at night was almost preferable. Unfortunately, we started having troubles with the car in the middle of the drive. I remember seeing a lot of white smoke, and my dad said it was sputtering. And thank God that we were not on a deserted and empty part of the highway. With his hazards on, he was able to slowly take an exit, got past and stared by multiple cars, and then rolled into the parking lot of a rundown truck stop. I do remember being my young self, asking some form of, "Are we there yet?" To which my dad told me that we had to fix the car. Instead of pulling into a parking spot, he pulled up to the curb and close to the building. There was a picnic table in the grass nearby that had an umbrella over it. My dad pulled me out of the car and had me sitting on the table, and he gave me a few of my toys and a juice box. He told me to stay there no matter what while he looked at the car. As mentioned, it was very hot that day, and when we talked about this when I was older, he told me that he didn't want to leave me in the car and risk me overheating, so he thought that the next best thing would be to sit me there in the shade. I was still pretty close to him, where all he had to do was to turn his head to the left, and then he would see me and would probably hear me if I tried talking to him. The problem, however, wouldn't be with me overheating, but himself. He said that he was already feeling ill and felt like his blood pressure was high, but he chalked it up to just being stressed out and hot. He said after finding out with what was wrong with it, he would sit with me to relax for a bit before we got back on the road. But he wouldn't get that far. He popped the hood, got in the driver's seat to get something, and then passed out. I didn't know anything was happening, so I just sat on the bench as I was told and shared my juice with me and my stuffed animal that I had. At one point, I saw a man walking out the store, and I remember thinking that he reminded me of my uncle. My Uncle Louis was a truck driver, and he always had on a pair of overalls. He also had a cowboy hat and sunglasses. This man was dressed the same way, so when he looked at me and smiled, I smiled and I waved back. I watched him as he walked along the side of the building, seeming to be looking around, and then he did a sharp turn and headed back in my direction. He then stood right across from me and said hello. I said hi back, and I asked him if he knew Uncle Louis. He laughed, and then said he thought he did, and asked who I was with. I told him my dad, and I pointed to our car. The guy then said something like, "Oh, it looks like your daddy could use some help. How about we surprise him with some ice cream? It's really hot out here." Again, I was very young. I knew that it was hot because my dress was sticking to me and starting to make me feel uncomfortable. But I could also tell that something was wrong with my dad by the way he was acting and how much he was sweating. This guy also seemed very nice, and because he did appear to be like my uncle, I thought that it would be okay. I also thought that this was supposed to help my dad, either with a car or to cool off or maybe just to make him happy, and that's what I wanted. I wanted to help him, so I agreed to go with him. I stood up, I went to walk around the other side of the bench, and I grabbed the man's hand. As we started walking, that was about the same time that my dad woke up. He said that when he came to, his immediate thought was me. He didn't know how long he had been out, so he jumped out of the car and saw me walking away with this unknown man. That's when he started running towards us, but he said that his legs felt like concrete, so his next option was to yell for me. The only thing he managed to get out was, "Maria, peligro!" which was basically danger in Spanish. He was bilingual, and I was starting to learn Spanish with my English, but I didn't know it very well. But one of the things that I was taught was stranger danger. However, we would later learn this, but my dad was amid a heat stroke, so with being very weak, all he could muster was danger. After shouting this, he then stumbled forward, falling to the ground, hitting his head on the curb. Hearing the fear in my father's usually booming voice really startled me, and when I saw him fall, I immediately screamed and the guy I was walking with took off. My dad and I both remember the guy being white, but of course, I didn't know if he knew Spanish and what he just said, or if it was just the fact that my dad caught him, so he took off. I ran to my dad, who was now on the ground, and all I knew to do was to scream and cry and shaking him to get him to wake up. A lady in the truck stop heard all of this and then ran out to try and help. And after that, it all kind of ran together. I remember a few other people helping by, putting cold rags on my dad. I remember the ambulance coming and then my dad waking up. They had to calm him down as he was panicking because he couldn't see me initially. The lady was sitting on the bench with me, trying to keep me calm and out of the EMT's way. When I called out for him though, and he knew that I was okay, he then started to calm down too. I know the EMTs wanted him to go to the hospital to see if he had a concussion, but he refused. After he cooled down, he said that he was feeling much better and that he needed to fix his car so we could all get back on the road. The lady that was with me had my dad pull his car into the truck garage to take a look at it while he rested inside the AC. My dad said the issue had something to do with the radiator, and they only asked him to pay for the part which they had and that they wouldn't charge for the labor. I remember the lady being very kind. She asked me questions about myself and my family while the EMTs were there. She gave me a push pop and some water and let me keep the little pool stuffed animal toy thing. It was like the water footballs that you toss around in a pool, but it was a rabbit, I think. She had soaked it in cold water for me to help keep me cool too. So, to wrap things up, the guy unfortunately fled. He was driving a big truck, so they had his license plate number and knew the business thanks to the giant logo on the trailer. We used this to contact the company and the police to report it, but my dad said that he never heard anything back, so we assume that they either never found or caught the guy, or unfortunately, they didn't take it seriously. We did make it to Mexico with a day to spare before his mom passed. It was one hell of a trip for us, and I became even closer to my dad after that. It's like we really became partners, always watching out for each other. Growing up, I knew I was adopted. My parents were always very open about it with me and gave me as much information as they knew or could when I asked questions. They have and always will be my parents to me. But as I got older, I was curious about my biological parents. I wanted to know more about them, who they were and what they looked like. And not to mention, I thought that it was important to know about any possible genetic and health concerns. So with the information I was given by my parents and the adoption place that they went through, I was able to learn more about my mother as she consented to be contacted by me if I wanted to. I spoke to my biological mother on the phone, and to my surprise, she was happy to hear from me, and the conversation just felt natural. Because of how well this went, I made plans to go and meet her in person. However, she lived in Utah, and my family and I lived in Wyoming, so I made a solo road trip out of it. My parents were even happy for me and encouraged it. I was in a great mindset at that time, and things were going well, and I felt like I was both getting closure and filling holes in my life. It was a great day to be on the road. The weather was perfect, there was minimal traffic, and I was just enjoying the drive while also playing out different scenarios and making plans with my biological mother. However, as the sun was beginning to set, I started to become tired, but I guess because I was too excited, I didn't want to sleep yet. So instead, I stopped to get a bite to eat, hoping that it might give me some energy to keep going. It worked for a few hours, but ultimately, I wasn't going to be able to avoid it. I had taken long trips like this before on my own, and I didn't need much, so I typically slept in my car rather than getting a hotel room. I took the next exit, and I pulled into the parking lot of a store that was 24 hours. I felt those were at least safer as there were always someone there, and in case that I needed a restroom, I had one available. I actually did go in the store. I think it was like a convenience store, but not a gas station as there were no pumps there. I grabbed something to drink, used the restroom, and I started heading back to my car. As I was walking there, I started hearing someone shouting from behind me. It was as if they were trying to get someone's attention, so it didn't sound alarming, scary, or angry. But since it was shouting nonetheless, I turned around to see what was happening. I saw a normal guy, maybe in his 40s. His hair was long and stringy, and he also had a pretty long beard. He was wearing jeans and a denim jacket with a dark-colored shirt under it. And to my surprise, he was waving me down. I stopped to hear him out as he was caught up to me, and he asked if I had a cigarette. I apologized and I told him that I didn't smoke, and he seemed like he was trying to figure out something else to say or ask. He then looked at my hand as I was carrying my bottle of tea and asked if I had anything else to drink. The guy seemed completely normal and maybe just a little down on his luck or something. Or hell, maybe he was just a mooch and trying to get anything he could for free. Either way, he wasn't being aggressive or annoying, so I pulled out the change that I got from my purchase. I paid with a 10, so I had like 5 left and some ones that I just shoved in my pocket, and I just gave it to the man. He smiled and seemed genuinely thankful for it, making a comment how he would be able to get smokes and also a drink with it. I just kind of smiled back and said something like, "Oh, no problem, man. Enjoy your night." He waved goodbye and then headed back towards the store. I then got in my car. I had parked close to the front, and then I drove it to the back of the lot, parked, and then settled in to sleep for the night. I drifted off to sleep pretty quickly, but then I remember hearing what sounded like scratching. I was still in half of a sleep state and thought that it was part of my dream. You know that feeling, kind of like when you hear your alarm in your dream. But then, when the sound became faster and a bit louder, it finally jolted me awake and I looked around to find the source of the sound. It didn't take me long to figure out, because when I looked over the passenger door, I saw the same guy from earlier messing with my door handle. I turned on my cab light and I cracked the window on my side, the driver's side, and I asked him what the hell he was doing. The guy didn't even jump or look away from the handle when I did this, so I knocked on the passenger window to get his attention. He finally looked up at me, and with a deadpan look on his face, he asked if I would let him in so we could talk. However, something seemed off. The monotone way that he said it, and how he was so persistent on trying the door put me on the edge. So I didn't unlock the door or anything, but I asked what he wanted to talk about. He would refuse to answer. He just kept saying in the same robotic voice, "I just want to talk about things. Please open the door." Again, that uneasy feeling was still there, And even though I gave this guy some money, there was still no way that I was going to let this stranger in my car in a small enclosed area. I told him that I couldn't and that I needed to sleep, but he just shouted no at me and continued trying the handle, but getting more aggressive with it. After this going on for a few minutes, trying to figure out what I could do to get him to leave, I decided that it was best to just leave. I put my keys in the glove box, and as I went to grab them, this guy's demeanor changed. He began kicking the door and slamming into the window. I could see it slightly bend and began to worry that he would actually manage to break it. With my hands now shaking, I tried to put the key in the ignition and start the car. I managed to get it started and burned out before he could break the window at least. But I had to go around the median to leave, which unfortunately gave this guy enough time to pick up a rock, chuck it at my car, and unfortunately caused my rear view window to crack. I got out of that parking lot and saw the guy in my mirror chasing me for a second until I reached the intersection. I had only been asleep for about 2 hours, but with my heart now racing, I was fully awake and I decided not to stop driving. I didn't stop until the sun came up, to which I finally took a break at a McDonald's. I called my parents from there and I told them what happened, but tried keeping it lighthearted as to not worry my mother. And after talking to them and also a quick meal, I was feeling more grounded and I got back on the road to finish my drive. I arrived at my biological mother's home after that with no other incidents, but I also didn't stop again, other than for the normal food or restroom break. Obviously, I don't know what that guy's intentions were, but because of that feeling that wouldn't go away, I can't help but feel that it wasn't going to be to ask for more money or any innocent conversation. The fact that his demeanor changed within a second terrified me even more. So I was just glad that I got out of there before he was able to get in, and even more thankful that I woke up to the initial sounds. This happened to me and my boyfriend when we went on a road trip a few years ago. It wasn't our first one, nor the last, so we were pretty accustomed to the road. We knew our limits when it came to how long we could drive without stopping, when we needed to sleep and things like that. We both typically stayed awake to keep each other company, but one of us would occasionally take a nap if we knew that we were going to be switching out and driving through the night. That's what takes us to this incident that I wanted to share. We were taking a road trip towards the northeast to see one of our favorite bands, and it was only about a 20-hour drive. We wanted to do it in one go, giving us more time and money to spend at our destination. So we made arrangements and planned out how long we would both drive as to not have one person drained or driving more than the other. I felt like this was something that a lot of people don't think about, which can lead to a lot of accidents. So make sure to plan this out to some extent before getting to the road. The drive started fine, and I agreed to drive first, as my boyfriend, Wyatt, has better eyesight, and I also don't want to drive at night. We stopped as the sun was going down to fuel up and grab something quick to eat. And then, we started back on our path, knowing that we still had a bit of a drive ahead of us. However, I was starting to feel a bit drowsy, and after letting Wyatt know, he suggested that I try sleeping some to prepare in case that we needed to switch out. I asked him if he was sure, and he said that he was, affirming that he did not feel tired in the slightest. So, I got comfortable in my seat, and I started drifting off. It started as light dozing, where I could still hear the music playing, but your body feels heavy, and you know that you're starting to fall asleep. And soon after, I was pretty clean out as I remember that I couldn't hear the music anymore. I don't recall the details of it now, but I know I was sleeping heavy enough that I was daydreaming at the time because I remember thinking that it was weird. However, I was abruptly awoken by the worst scream that I have ever heard coming from Wyatt. I just remember it sounded like he was terrified, and when I opened my eyes, all I saw was a bright light that pretty much swallowed us. It was dead of night, yet all I could see was the light. That's when Wyatt hit the brakes and swerved the car over towards the side of the road. However, this ended up being a dream within a dream, I guess. Because when I woke up screaming, startling Wyatt enough to pull over to try and calm me, I remember tears streaming down my face and asking him what happened and what that was. But he looked so confused and asked me what I was talking about. After I finally stopped talking and listened to him, I realized that everything was fine. He said that nothing had happened on the road. In fact, there hadn't even been any cars in sight, and I woke up screaming, causing him to jump. So, I explained to him what I had seen or dreamt, I guess, and he comforted me again and said that we were okay. Everything felt so real, down to even hearing music playing and the low humming sound of the tires on the road. We sat there on the shoulder with our hazards on, just giving ourselves a moment to compose ourselves. We talked just to calm our nerves before getting back on the road. Wyatt then made some kind of joke and then asked me to grab a snack from our bag in the back. I reached back to grab it, and as I was turning back around and putting my seatbelt back on, we started to see some lights in the distance coming from the opposite direction. It was one of those quick glances for me at first, and I went back to opening our bag of chips, when we then started to hear the blaring sound of a semi-horn. Being on such an empty and dark road, it was odd to hear it, which caused us to look up again. We watched as we heard the horn getting louder and saw the lights getting closer and brighter. We watched as it got closer, and we were able to make out another light coming from the side of the truck. We watched as it got close enough to finally make out what the light was. It was actually sparks from where a tire should be. The truck had its cabin light and brights on and was practically laying on the horn. And we watched it pass us, horrified, as this huge semi slowly drifted through to the other lanes of traffic and was grinding the cement barrier on our side. We turned around and watched this until the light was barely visible and we could no longer hear the horn. I didn't know what to say or what to do. If we were still on the road, what would have happened to us? In my dream, it has to be related, right? I woke up to Wyatt's scream, but also a bright light, like what you would expect if an 18-wheeler was coming right at you, right? I think Wyatt was trying to keep me calm, or maybe himself, and then said, "Well, that was pretty scary." I nodded in agreement, but we just continued to sit there. After a few minutes, he pulled out his phone and then called 911 and reported what we just saw while I sat there silently. After the call ended, we got back on the road and then drove in silence, practically tensing up at every car that we saw that came from the opposite side. I think the incident did a number on both of us because we ended up stopping at some grocery store and then slept there overnight. The next morning, I still felt a little shaken, but I just tried to move on, thinking that we just got lucky. We continued being vigilant on the road, and then we enjoyed our vacation. The rest of the trip did not have anything similar happen, and Wyatt seemed like he got past it. But I still had this lingering in my head as to what all of that was about. I know deja vu. I've experienced that many times before, but this dream felt so real Like it happened, but we just reset or something. Wyatt and I have since gone our separate ways, but we're still friends. However, we never talked about this since that time of that road trip, and when I had tried to bring it up before, he never wanted to talk about it either. Other than my sister and a friend, I haven't really talked to anyone about this because it's still something that disturbs me. But I finally felt the urge to share it to see if anyone else had experienced something similar. That way, at least, I would know that I am not alone. Hey there. I've been listening to your channel for a few months now, and hearing some of your older stories reminded me of an event that happened to me and a friend last year. This happened when me and my friend Morgan took a road trip to Las Vegas. It wasn't the first time that we had done this, and we've also learned a few things since our first trip. So by now, I felt that we were a bit more prepared. I took my car to the shop to make sure that everything was working as it should be. And then, we made a well-prepped cooler of healthy snacks and drinks, as well as a few energy drinks. We packed our bags and probably overpacked, but we made sure that we had everything, as well as some extras. I even refilled my emergency kit that I kept in my trunk. It had my normal first aid stuff, as well as a towel and a blanket, things like that. I had a few people make fun of me for my kit, including my boyfriend, saying that I was just overdoing it. And I always said that I would rather have it and never need it than, well, you know. I was living with Morgan and her sister at that time, which made it even more convenient for us, meaning that we're able to leave when we wanted without wasting more time meeting up. We stopped to have a light breakfast and also some coffee, and then we got on the road. The drive for the most part was very uneventful. I mean, it was a great drive. We did it in the early spring, so it wasn't cold and not too hot. It was honestly perfect. We just didn't have anything crazy or hectic happen or get in our way. We had several planned stops on the way, including a national park and museum, both of which were fantastic. I got to make my own geode, and it had a beautiful amethyst in it. I believe that we had just hit the Nevada border, and so we decided to stop at a hotel for the night. We still probably had about a day's worth of driving, so we wanted a place that we could stay and freshen up. And the hotel was your average hotel. We took our much-needed showers, enjoyed the included breakfast the next morning, and then just headed back to our car to get out of there. Well, this is where things got pretty chaotic. We probably had only been on the road for about an hour, just talking or whatever on a pretty open highway. There weren't many cars or whatsoever on the road, which was pretty nice. But then, I had a Jeep with dark tinted windows come up behind me. They weren't riding too close or anything, but it was just something that I took notice of. However, they did start getting closer, and again, I made a mental note of it. However, it wasn't consistent. They would get close and then let off, and then this would repeat. That's when I mentioned it to Morgan, because I thought that if they were in such a rush, why not just go around? It wasn't a single lane or anything, so they very well could have. Morgan said something about them either just being an ass or trying to be intimidating, and said not to worry about it too much at that time. However, it kept happening, and they were pushing it with how close they were getting, which made me lose my train of thought while we were talking. I pointed it out again to Morgan, and she turned back to look at it. We both agreed that it was getting weird and said that we should slow down. I was using cruise control, so I wasn't going under and was probably actually going slightly over. We were hoping that they would grow impatient and then finally just pass us. And it looked like that was finally happening when the Jeep went around and was then in the lane next to me. They were parallel to me, and because of what they were doing, we both looked over at them. The side windows were also dark, so we didn't see the driver until they rolled down their window. What we saw was some normal-looking guy, completely bald head, wearing some kind of plain t-shirt and sunglasses. Yet, I could tell by the wrinkles on his forehead and the clenched jaw that he looked furious, and I had no idea why. I kind of looked at him with a, "Can I help you?" kind of look, because I didn't know what his problem was. As I mentioned, it's not like I was driving erratically or stopping him from going around. The guy then motioned for me to pull over, and I immediately shook my head no. That only seemed to enrage him more as he began yelling at me to pull over. I think I speak for the both of us when I say that we were starting to grow a bit uneasy. There weren't many cars around at that exact moment. We were the only ones. The guy then slowed down and got back behind us, so Morgan immediately pulled out her phone and started recording it. I just continued driving, hoping to see an exit soon. I was trying to change the GPS to the next exit or a gas station or anything that would put us around more people, when we felt the car jolt forward a bit. This guy had now hit my car. Morgan started screaming and we were both asking what the hell this guy was trying to do. And then he rammed us again. I'm trying to keep us on the road while having a panic attack when Morgan said that she was going to call the cops and then turned back around in her seat. She was trying to explain to the dispatcher what was happening and we were struggling to give our location. I knew the name of the highway, but I kept missing the mile markers due to being so obviously distracted. I was able to find it thanks to my GPS and the operator instructing Morgan to check it. As they were talking to us about what to do, the guy again went to the lane next to us, window down, and shouted something that I couldn't make out. I guess he wasn't satisfied because he then hit my car from the side, which made me swerve, and I had to try and correct it so I didn't run off the road. Morgan again was screaming to the operator what was happening when he hit us one more time, closer to the back, which caused a very hard fishtail to start. And yes, I know how to correct a car when that happens, before someone says anything, but my efforts were in vain because the guy again managed to hit me, causing us to careen into the oncoming exit barrels, the exit that we were going to try to take. We slammed into on the passenger side. Both of us were still conscious, but hurt, so we were completely aware that this guy had driven past, but backed up to look at us with a creepy smile and then took off again. That was the last time we saw him. We sat there sobbing, terrified that this guy might come back, and I was worried about how damaged my car was. We weren't even in the same state that we lived in. How would we get home if it was totaled? It wasn't long before another car approached us and stopped to see if we were okay. It was an older guy, like a lot older, so we weren't exactly afraid of him. He just looked like a normal Good Samaritan. I started explaining what happened while also trying to help Morgan find her phone that, of course, went flying out of her hand. And once we found it, the operator was still on the phone, which, by the way, after hearing the screams and crash, I applaud them for still being there for us. So, we told them what happened, and they explained that the officers were almost there. I was able to get out of my door, and Morgan had to climb over to my side to get out. The old man stayed with us until the police arrived, and we gave him a hug, thanking him for trying to keep us calm and offering his coffee to us. We gave the police as much information as we could about the man and also the vehicle and how this came out of nowhere. They tried to play it as road rage taken too far, but if so, it was only on one side. Like I said, I never even saw the Jeep prior to him tailgating me. I didn't recognize the man, nor did Morgan. We tried explaining this to the police, but whether or not they believed us, they did agree that it was taken way too far. We had my car towed to the nearest auto shop, and the cops gave us a ride there for us to wait. Sadly, the whole right side was smashed in and unable to open the front passenger door, but just about everything under the hood was still fine. They replaced the wheel on the passenger side since it was bent or something, and tried to pull out some of the dents on that same side, but the door was still difficult to open. Overall, we were pretty shaken up, and the fact that we were so close to our destination, we thought that it would be a waste to turn back. Once we had calmed down and the car was done, we took it slow, driving on some side roads until we were ready to get back on the highway. I was still super nervous about it, worried that that guy may have never exited or has just been in the same area. But thankfully, we never had any more incidents. That's not to say that I didn't have a slight mental freakout anytime I saw a Jeep or someone following a little too close. We gave the police our information in case that they ever saw the Jeep or the guy, but as of me writing this, neither of us have heard from them. And this experience was terrifying for both of us, but it also left us confused. Again, I get road rage. I have shamefully flipped some people the bird for cutting me off, but I would never try to risk their life. On top of this, I have no idea what the hell I could have done to set this guy off. We still go on road trips, Morgan and I together and with the others, but I don't think that I would ever forget the feeling that I had that day, or the feeling like I was being targeted, or even the feeling that someone wanted me dead, or at least severely injured. So, if you are on the road, just take some precautions. Make sure people know where you are and how to read mile markers, and always wear your seatbelt. When my parents got a divorce, me and my two brothers had to deal with a custody trade-off. During the summers, we'd go to my dad and stepmom's place for 1 to 2 weeks and then go back to my mom's. One summer, my dad and stepmom would be driving to the middle of nowhere, Iowa, to see her family, and you guessed it, that was the week at their place. I didn't care much to be around her side of the family, but I did enjoy the long car rides. They had a kid together, so it would be the 4 of us in their giant van that they had, which was also nice. I got to sit in the middle seat, meaning that I got a spot to myself. My stepsister is in the next seat to me, and my 2 little brothers in the back. This was before we had smartphones though, so all I had to keep me sane was my knockoff MP3 player and my drawing pad and a book that I was reading. So, off we were on this road trip for around 12 hours or so. Maybe it was longer, but being a kid, I know it felt like forever. We also had to stop overnight once. Once it started getting dark out, everyone was starting to fall asleep. I remember listening to my music when my dad said something to me. We were the only ones awake at that time. He said that he needed to stop to use the restroom and try to stay awake and ask if I needed to go, because it would probably be the last stop for the night. I told him no, so I just sat in the car and waited. After a few, he came back and we headed out for what I assume was a few more hours of driving. Not long after we left the gas station though, I ended up falling asleep. When I woke up, it was still pitch dark and the car was off and everyone else was fast asleep. I got up and I looked at the time on my dad's phone to see if anyone would be up soon. But it was only like 2 or 3 in the morning, so I assumed that we would still have a few hours before we were moving again. I laid back in my seat for a bit trying to fall back asleep, with no luck. My dad snores, like a lot, so I more so sat looking up at the roof, waiting to eventually pass out. But after a few minutes of that not working, I decided to look around to see if I could see anything. From the front, I couldn't see much, but a long concrete parking lot, and to the left, I could see the highway which was giving off the most light. And from my side, there appeared to be a small concrete building with one street lamp above it on the opposite side. It appeared that we were at the back of the building, as there weren't any doors on the side that I could see. At that time, I didn't know where we were or what I was looking at, and at the end of the parking lot on the side that I was on, there were some trees after it, like the type you see lining a highway. They were tall, bunched together, and you can barely be able to see past them. I decided that while I couldn't see much, I would try drawing the trees in hopes that that would make me tired. As I started drawing them, I looked back over to get a good reference when I noticed 2 particular shorter trees that looked dead. I started staring a little harder to try and focus and get a better idea of what I was looking at. At this point, I had my head to the window, hands cupped around them, staring out at these trees. That's when I finally realized that I wasn't looking at trees. The 2 shorter ones appeared to be legs. They weren't swaying and bending even slightly with the wind. They stood perfectly still until I saw them all move like they were going to walk away or readjust how they were standing. I couldn't see much of the head though, as it led right up to the dark parts of the trees. I thought, okay, so this is like a really big deer or something. So I continued to watch it for a bit, and then I tried to add the deer to my picture. When I looked back up, I didn't see it at first, thinking that it just moved. I then started looking around for it, and it didn't take long to find it as I saw something small fall from a tree that the creature was standing near. And then I watched it practically crawl down that same tree. It was actually pretty unsettling. I can only describe it as human, trying to walk on all fours or trying to climb a tree like a cat. The limbs were all just as long as I had seen them too. The head though, it looked horrendous. It was round like a human's, but it looked too big for the body, and it also had what appeared to be 2 small horns. Something told me that something wasn't right here, but I had to keep watching. As it finally got to the ground, I saw it lower its head and pretty much just tear apart whatever it got from that tree. It was horrible, and I was actually pretty freaked out. I thought this was a deer at first, but I didn't think that deers could climb trees, and I also didn't know that they were carnivorous. I stopped watching as I sat on the floor of the van, thinking about what I saw and what to do. Do I wake someone up? Do I still try to draw it? Or should I just keep watching it? Of course, I decided to look for it again. And when I looked back up, I noticed the thing had stopped moving again. So I did the same and I just stared and watched. That's when I think it got tired of me watching it too. I noticed that it turned in my direction instead of at a side and appeared to be looking right towards me. I couldn't see its eyes, but I could tell. You get that feeling when you're being watched, and it was an awful feeling. I decided to go back in my seat, to cover my head up with a sweater that I was wearing, and try to fall back to sleep now. Unfortunately, the watching feeling was not going away. I uncovered my head and I looked back out the window to see that this thing had gotten closer. I quickly covered my head back up, grabbed my MP3 player, and I tried to drown out my thoughts and silly fears. I was just a kid, so surely this was just an animal that I didn't know of, right? And after a while, I had finally fallen asleep. I woke up again due to my dad snoring and my music ending. And when I awoke, because of the way my head was facing, I could see out the front where it was still dark. And when I pulled my sweater down all the way, to my horror, I saw a face on the other side of my window, with their hands cupped around it. I could clearly see human eyes, but there was no nose, not even a slit where the nose could be. This, of course, made me scream and jump out of my seat, waking everyone else up. My stepmom, being startled, was the first to ask what happened. When I looked back at the window, there was nothing there. I didn't want to scare my siblings, so I just told them that a bird hit the window and scared me. My dad then went and walked around the car and didn't see anything, but since we were all awake, we just decided to go ahead and leave. Apparently, we had stopped at some kind of rest stop. The building we were parked by was a restroom, but there was not a single other vehicle around us. I didn't get out to use the restroom as I was too scared, and I decided to hold it until we stopped somewhere for breakfast. I still haven't told anyone other than a good friend of mine because I feel like I was just seeing things. And I didn't know if anyone would believe me. One thing that I do know that was real though was the drawing that I did that night that I recently found. Trees, darkness, and a deer-like creature with no head. Hello everyone, it's your creepy sister here. Thank you so much for watching the video. I really appreciate it. I would also like to give some extra love to my Patreon members, my channel members, and also my tippers. Thank you so much. If you would like to extend a little bit more support for the channel, don't forget to leave a like and a comment down below. If you would like to become a Patreon member, a channel member, a tipper, or even to buy merch, check out the links in the description below. Again, thank you. And I hope you stay scared because your fear feeds me.